Somewhere in a limestone cave, in near total darkness, there's a hand pressed against stone. Not a real hand anymore. Just an outline, red ochre blown around fingers that stopped moving tens of thousands of years ago. The person who made it has no name we'll ever know. No grave we can visit, no language we can translate. But their hand is still there, waiting. And here's the question that should keep you up at night, or in this case, help you fall asleep. What does a single handprint actually prove about a world we can barely imagine? Because think about what that hand represents. This wasn't an accident. Someone gathered pigment. Someone chose this wall in this cave, in this exact spot, over every other surface available to them. Someone climbed, maybe crawled, maybe carried fire into a space where fire had never existed before, just to leave a mark that says, I was here. Think, plan, act. That's not instinct, that's intention. And intention this old changes everything we thought we understood about who these people were. If you're listening to this to drift off, that's exactly why I make these. So tell me, where are you right now and what time is it there? I love checking the comments and seeing it's 2 a.m. in Sydney while it's dinner time in Denver, all of us drifting through the same story at completely different moments. It's strange and kind of beautiful, honestly, a little bit like the paintings themselves made in one moment, still reaching people tens of thousands of years later. If you want these without the ads breaking up your sleep, follow along on Spotify. It supports the channel and keeps things running smoothly through the night. And if you've got 30 seconds before you drift off, a 5-star review helps more than you'd probably guess. It's basically the modern version of leaving your handprint on a wall. Small gesture, bigger impact than you'd think. Now tonight, we're going somewhere most people never think to look. Not to castles or empires or wars. We're going into caves. Deep, dark, mineral-veined caves, where some of the oldest known images made by human hands are still sitting on stone, untouched for unimaginable stretches of time. We'll follow the evidence exactly where it leads, from cave walls in Indonesia to the famous painted halls of France and Spain, from uranium decay chains in laboratories to heated debates between archaeologists who don't always agree on what they're looking at. Because here's the truth, nobody has this fully figured out, and that uncertainty, that's part of what makes it fascinating. But underneath all of it, there's one question that ties this entire story together. Why did humans start making images at all? Before writing, before farming, before cities, kings, or recorded names. Before almost everything we associate with civilization, someone, somewhere, decided that reality wasn't enough. That the world needed to be represented, not just lived in. That urge to create something that outlives you may be one of the oldest fingerprints of the human mind we've ever found. And tonight we're going to trace it as far back as the evidence allows. Before we go any further into these caves, we need to slow down on one word. Oldest, because that word gets thrown around like it's simple, like there's a clean list somewhere ranking every painting by age, and the winner gets a little gold medal for being first. That's not how any of this works, and honestly, once you understand why, the whole story gets more interesting, not less. Let's start with something basic that most people never stop to think about. Cave art and rock art are not the same thing, even though we use the words interchangeably in casual conversation. Rock art is the umbrella term. It covers everything. Paintings, engravings, carvings, anything made on natural rock surfaces, whether that's deep inside a limestone cave or out in the open on a cliff face under full sun. Cave art is more specific. It's rock art that happens to be located inside caves, usually in the dark, sometimes so deep that reaching it required crawling through passages barely wide enough for a human body. Then there's the word painting itself, which sounds straightforward but actually covers a surprisingly wide range of techniques. A painting can mean pigment applied with a finger or a brush made from fur or plant fibre. It can mean pigment blown through a hollow bone or reed, creating that famous stenciled effect around a hand pressed flat against stone. It can even include outlines, where the artist traces the edge of a shape without filling it in at all. Some researchers count engravings, lines scratched into soft rock, as a related but separate category. Others lump everything together under the broader term parietal art, which just means art on walls, floors, or ceilings. Depending on which definition you use, the list of oldest known examples shifts entirely. So already, before we even get into specific caves or specific dates, we've got a problem. Are we talking about the oldest handprint, the oldest deliberate use of pigment, the oldest recognizable image of an animal, the oldest abstract mark that might mean something symbolic or might just be a scratch? These are different questions with different answers, and news headlines rarely make that distinction clear. Now let's talk about dating, because this is where things get genuinely complicated in a way that even professional archaeologists argue about at conferences. When scientists say a cave painting is a certain age, they're almost never dating the pigment directly. Most of the time, that's simply not possible. Ochre, one of the most common pigments used in ancient art, is just iron oxide, a mineral. Minerals don't contain carbon in a form that radiocarbon dating can use, and they don't decay in a predictable way that gives you a date on their own. So scientists have to get clever. They look for something near the painting that can be dated, and then they make an argument about how that date relates to the art itself. One major method involves thin mineral crusts called calcite, which form naturally on cave walls over thousands of years as water seeps through limestone and leaves behind deposits, layer by layer, like incredibly slow dripping candle wax. If a calcite crust has formed on top of a painting, scientists can date that crust using Uranium-Series dating, which measures the decay of uranium into thorium at a known rate. If the crust sits on top of the pigment, then the painting must be at least as old as the bottom layer of that crust. This gives you what's called a minimum age. Not necessarily the actual age of the painting, but a floor beneath which the painting cannot possibly be younger. That distinction matters enormously, and it's one that headlines love to skip over. When you hear that a painting is at least 45,000 years old, that phrase "at least" is doing an enormous amount of work. The painting could be exactly that age, or it could be significantly older, with the calcite crust simply being the earliest layer scientists happen to measure. We're essentially reading a floor, not a ceiling. Other dating methods look at material trapped in cave sediment layers, the same techniques used in general archaeology. If you find charcoal or burned bone in a layer directly associated with a painted surface, you can radiocarbon date that organic material and infer that the painting likely comes from a similar period. But this only works if the layers haven't been disturbed, and caves are notoriously messy in that regard. Water moves things, animals move things, ancient humans themselves moved things, sometimes returning to the same cave across many generations, adding new layers of sediment and new paintings on top of older ones, without any regard for the archaeologists who would eventually try to sort it all out, tens of thousands of years later. And that brings us to another wrinkle: contamination. Caves are not sealed time capsules, no matter how much we wish they were. Groundwater carries minerals from other locations. Modern visitors, sometimes explorers who wandered in centuries before formal archaeology existed, occasionally introduced organic material simply by breathing, touching, or even camping inside these spaces. Even careful excavation can accidentally mix layers that should have stayed separate. Every single sample scientists collect has to be evaluated for the possibility that it's telling a story that isn't quite true, either too old or too young, because something got mixed in from somewhere else. Then there's the issue of retouching, which sounds like a minor detail but actually undermines a huge amount of confident dating. Ancient painters, it turns out, did not treat cave walls as untouchable museum pieces. They came back, sometimes centuries later, sometimes thousands of years later. Later visitors added new pigment on top of old images, extended limbs, added new animals beside existing ones, or simply refreshed colours that had faded. This means a single painted panel might actually represent multiple phases of activity, separated by enormous stretches of time, all layered together in a way that looks, to modern eyes, like one unified image. If you date the wrong layer, you get the wrong story entirely. All of this means the record we have isn't fixed. It's moving constantly in both directions. A painting considered the oldest known example in the world can lose that title overnight if a new discovery comes along with a more securely dated context, or if new technology allows researchers to re-examine existing sites with greater precision. This has already happened multiple times in the last few decades alone, and it will almost certainly happen again, possibly before this very episode is finished being written, let alone by the time you're hearing it. So how do serious researchers actually approach this? Not with certainty, and not by clinging to any single method as if it delivers a perfect verdict. The most careful conclusions come from combining several lines of evidence at once, dating results from more than one technique, careful archaeological context showing what layers surround the art and iconography, meaning the actual visual content of the painting itself, compared against known artistic traditions from similar time periods and regions. Even then, conclusions get published with careful, hedged language. Words like approximately at minimum consistent with. Scientists aren't being evasive when they use that language. They're being honest about a field where certainty is rare and revision is normal. So, as we step into these caves tonight, in Sulawesi, in France, in Spain, keep this complexity in the back of your mind. When you hear a number attached to a painting's age, that number represents current best evidence, carefully gathered, but never final. And that uncertainty isn't a weakness in the story. It's part of what makes searching for the beginning of human image making feel less like reading a settled history book, and more like watching a mystery slowly, patiently unfold in real time. So with all of that in mind, with dates that are more like carefully argued ranges than bold, stamped numbers, let's walk into one of the places that forced everyone to rethink the story. Not in France, not in Spain. On an island in Indonesia shaped like a many-armed starfish pushing out into the warm waters between Asia and Australia. Sulawesi. If you've never heard of it, you're not alone. For a long time, Sulawesi barely appeared in global conversations about early art. The big names were European: Lascaux, Chauvet, Altamira. If textbooks mentioned Asia at all, it was usually as an afterthought. Then, over the past couple of decades, teams of researchers started hiking into the limestone hills of Sulawesi, and the narrative quietly began to crack. Sulawesi's interior is riddled with karst landscapes. Think fractured limestone, sinkholes, cliffs and cave systems that snake back into the rock like a second hidden geography. Water has been seeping through those stones for hundreds of thousands of years, dripping, evaporating, and leaving behind those thin calcite skins we talked about earlier. The same slow chemistry that frustrates archaeologists by covering paintings also protects them. Pigments go on the wall, and eventually the cave starts to wrap them in mineral armour. The climate helps too. Outside, the air is warm and humid, but inside, in the deeper chambers where many of these images sit, conditions are relatively stable. Not perfectly so, nothing on Earth is, but calm enough that tiny grains of iron oxide and manganese can cling to the stone for tens of thousands of years, long after the people who placed them there have disappeared without a trace. When researchers began systematically surveying these caves, they started seeing a familiar shape. A human hand, or rather its absence. Across Sulawesi's caves, there are hand stencils, silhouettes made by placing a hand flat against the wall and then blowing pigment around it, leaving a ghostly outline where skin blocked the spray. The effect is strangely intimate. The pigment is rough, sometimes speckled, sometimes fading at the edges, but the negative space in the middle is crisp enough that you can see finger length, the curve of a thumb, the spread of a palm. In some panels, one hand stands alone. In others, there are clusters, hands overlapping, different sizes, different orientations, as if several people crowded in and took turns, pressing themselves against the same patch of stone. Some hands look small enough to have belonged to adolescents, or perhaps adults of a different body type. We don't know, but the variety hints at a social act, not a solitary artist working in secrecy. Near these hands, and sometimes sharing the same walls, are animals. This is where Sulawesi begins to drift away from the imagery that people tend to associate with European caves. You don't see herds of bison and horses here. Instead, you see the outline of a warty pig, or a babirusa, the so-called deer pig with its bizarre curling tusks that arc backward toward the animal's forehead. You see anoa, dwarf buffalo that look like small, sturdy cousins of bigger bovids. These are not generic animals. They are local fauna, creatures that still live in altered ecosystems on the island today. One of the most famous paintings shows a Sulawesi warty pig, its body filled in with a reddish pigment, outlines carefully traced, facial features suggested with a few deliberate lines. Above its back, there are short strokes that some researchers think may indicate bristles or hair. It's not just pig-shaped, it's pig-specific. Whoever painted it knew these animals well enough to catch their posture and form. Then there are the scenes that look, at first glance, like stories frozen in mid-movement. In one cave, a panel appears to show several animals and small part, human part, something else figures interacting. Some of these figures seem to have elongated snouts or tails. Are they humans wearing animal masks? Mythic beings? Something else entirely? No one can say for sure. What we can say is that they're arranged in relation to one another in a way that doesn't look random. Lines and gazes seem to converge. Bodies seem to cluster around particular animals. This is where the phrase narrative scene starts to hover in the air, never quite landing. It's possible these compositions represent hunting stories, or ritual dramas or mythic episodes told and retold around ancient fires. It's also possible they're something we don't have a modern category for at all. But their complexity nudged researchers toward a conclusion. By the time these images were made, people on Sulawesi weren't just experimenting with marks. They were arranging figures, relationships, and perhaps events in a way that suggests structured thought. As dates came back from the calcite crusts overlaying some of these stencils and animals, the shock began to register. Minimum ages in the range of 40,000 years. Then older. Some hand stencils in Sulawesi appear to be at least as ancient as the oldest known in Europe. Some animal figures currently have minimum ages that push them into or beyond the same time frame as the famous European caves that had long been treated as the cradle of figurative art. This didn't just add a new dot on the map. It undercut a comfortable assumption. That complex image making, especially figurative art and possible storytelling scenes, began in Ice Age Europe and spread outward from there like a ripple. Instead, Sulawesi suggested a different picture. Either similar capacities were emerging independently in distant regions, or the roots of this visual imagination go back further than the European record alone implies, carried by populations who had long since left Africa and moved east. In either case, first art could no longer be told as a single linear Eurocentric tale. The imagery itself also speaks quietly about daily life. Those pigs and anoa were not decorative choices plucked from nowhere. They were the large mammals available in the forests and clearings of Pleistocene Sulawesi, potential prey, potential symbols and constant presences in the sensory world of the artists. To paint them is to say, in some sense, these are the beings that matter to us. The hands alongside them might be signatures or marks of participation, or something more ritualized, individuals aligning themselves bodily with the animals that fed and perhaps spiritually anchored their communities. And yet, for all this richness, enormous questions remain open. We don't know what species of humans made these paintings. Anatomically modern humans were present in the region by that time, according to many lines of evidence, but Southeast Asia also has a complex record of earlier and parallel hominin populations. The safest phrasing is simply humans like us, or nearly like us, capable of abstract thought and intricate manual skill, left these traces. The exact mixture of ancestries in their veins is still a matter of ongoing research. We also don't know how long these artistic traditions persisted in any one cave or valley. Were hand stencils a fashion that flared for a few generations and vanished, or a motif revisited over thousands of years? Did narratives change as climates shifted, as coastlines moved, as islands connected and separated with the rise and fall of sea levels? The walls are layered, but the timeline of those layers is still hazy. What Sulawesi gives us for now is a strong hint that by 40,000+ years ago, and possibly earlier, humans far from Europe were already thinking with images in complex ways. They were using the bodies of local animals and the outlines of their own hands to carve meaning into stone, deep inside hills where time moves slowly and pigments can sleep, undisturbed for entire ice ages. And as we let those hands and animals fade into the dark behind us, we can turn, finally, to the caves that first captured the world's attention and see them not as the place where art began, but as one chapter in a much wider, older story. When people first started to piece together the deep history of art, they didn't begin with Sulawesi or South Africa or the Arabian Peninsula. They began mostly by accident in Europe. If we lay the best-known European caves out on a simplified timeline, the order might surprise you. Altamira in northern Spain was the first to be discovered in modern times in the late 19th century. But in terms of age, it sits roughly around 20,000 years ago for many of its most famous images, with some layers older and some younger. Chauvet in southern France, which no one knew about until 1994, goes much further back. Some of its paintings appear to date to around 36,000 years ago, maybe a bit more or less depending on how you interpret the samples and the methods used. Lascaux, also in France, and once nicknamed the Sistine Chapel of Prehistory, sits between them roughly around 21,000 to 17,000 years ago for its main painting episodes. So if you imagine a broad arc, Chauvet toward the earlier end, Lascaux and Altamira closer to the last glacial maximum, all of them firmly in the Ice Age, but not at the very beginning of figurative art anymore. More like a late, dazzling flourish in a story that we now know started earlier and in more places than once assumed. Each of these caves has its own personality, its own visual dialect. Chauvet feels, in many ways, like an early explosion of sophistication. The walls are full of lions, rhinos, mammoths, bears, bison, horses, animals that would have roamed the cold steppe-like environments outside. Many figures are drawn in profile, but with little tricks that suggest volume and movement. The artists used the natural bulges of the rock to give bodies roundness, the suggestion of muscles and bellies. They added multiple legs to some animals, staggered slightly, so that when you look at them your brain reads running rather than standing still. They shaded with charcoal, smudging and layering, creating gradients that make some heads and flanks look almost three-dimensional. It's tempting to look at Chauvet and say, this is where it all begins. But Sulawesi, and a growing list of other sites, quietly tap you on the shoulder and remind you not to confuse earliest discovered or most visually striking with first in the world. Chauvet is early for Europe. It may not be early for human image making in general. Lascaux, painted more than 10,000 years later, looks like the work of a culture that had been refining these techniques for a very long time. The famous Hall of the Bulls, for example, presents massive aurochs, wild cattle with curved horns that twist in an almost impossible way. The horns are drawn in a sort of twisted perspective, where both horns are visible even though the body is in profile. Anatomically, that's wrong, but visually it feels right. Your brain accepts the illusion and reads it as depth. The painters at Lascaux layered colour, using black, brown, red and yellow pigments, sometimes blending, sometimes outlining. They took advantage of the rock's contours to make an animal's flank seem to swell outward, or a head to tilt. Some figures are carefully modelled with shading and internal lines, suggesting muscles or fur. Others are more schematic, quick outlines, simplified shapes, perhaps added centuries later by different hands with different priorities. Altamira in Spain adds its own twist. The bison on the cave's sloping ceiling are richly coloured, with deep reds and browns. Again, the contours of the rock are integral. A natural bump becomes a bison's shoulder. A dip becomes the hollow of a belly. The animals seem to roll and shift with the uneven stone, as if they're halfway between the physical rock and some internal remembered landscape of herds and seasons. Across all three caves, one pattern emerges when you look closely: superimposition. Paintings layered on top of paintings, a horse's head ghosting through the flank of a bison, a rhino crossing the body of an older lion. Sometimes you can see 3, 4, even more phases stacked together, each done in slightly different style with slightly different pigment, sometimes separated by thousands of years. This stacking is not just visual clutter, it's a clue. It suggests that these caves weren't decorated in a single burst by one generation of artists and then abandoned. They were returned to, revisited, reinscribed. One group comes in, lights their lamps, paints a panel. Centuries pass. Another group, perhaps descendants, perhaps distant cousins in the same broad tradition, arrives and adds their own animals, sometimes respecting the older ones, sometimes painting right across them. The wall becomes a palimpsest of decisions: preserve, echo, override. In a way, each superimposition is both an act of continuity and of change. To come back to the same place means that stories about the cave, knowledge of its depths, and the practical skill to move safely through it were being passed down. To paint something new over something old suggests that meanings weren't frozen. They evolved, just as climates and animal populations did. The reason we can see this process at all has a lot to do with geology. These caves are carved into limestone, which dissolves and reforms with water. Over time, thin calcite films grow over some paintings, sealing them in. In other spots, the surface stays dry and open. The temperature in the deep chambers is relatively stable, cool, with high humidity that slows down the flaking and crumbling that would destroy pigments exposed to open air and sunlight. There's no wind to scour the walls, no ultraviolet radiation bleaching colours away. Just a slow drip of water, the steady exhale of stone, and the occasional intrusion of animals, and, much later, humans like us. Where conditions were just right, enough mineral protection, not too much flooding, no catastrophic collapses, the walls became time capsules. Where conditions were wrong, anything that was ever painted is simply gone, leaving no trace that we can see. That asymmetry matters. When we look at Chauvet, Lascaux, or Altamira, we're seeing a tiny biased sample of what once existed. These caves are famous in part because they are spectacular and in part because they survived. But spectacular survival is not the same thing as primacy. The deeper timeline, especially once you factor in Sulawesi, South African rock shelters, and other sites still emerging from obscurity, suggests that the skills on display in Europe, the shading, the motion effects, the perspective tricks, the layering, are the flowering of long-running traditions, not sudden inventions. Europe's caves, then, are less like the birthplace of art and more like one bright, late chapter in a book that had already been written for tens of thousands of years. Their fame can make them feel central. The evidence whispers that they are part of a much wider, messier, and older web of image-making that spanned continents. To understand how we place them in time at all, and how we tell older from younger in this dim, overlapping record, we need to turn to the tools that let scientists coax dates out of stone, pigment and mineral crusts, the quiet chemistry that underlies every age range we've mentioned so far. If you stand in front of a painted bison in the beam of a weak lamp, there is nothing about the image itself that tells you, I am 19,000 years old, or I watched the ice sheets retreat. The pigments don't come with timestamps. The stone doesn't announce when it last met a human hand. So archaeologists have to do something more indirect, and in a way, more delicate. They date the things that formed above, below, and around the art. They date the chemistry of the cave itself. One of the main tools for this is something called Uranium-Series dating, often shortened to uranium-thorium. It sounds futuristic, but it relies on a quiet, predictable process happening inside the rock. Limestone caves often grow thin skins of calcite, little translucent crusts formed when mineral-rich water drips or seeps across the walls. When that calcite first precipitates, it contains tiny traces of uranium dissolved from the bedrock. Over time, that uranium decays into thorium at a known rate. Because thorium is not soluble in water in the same way, it wasn't present in the calcite at the moment it formed. It has to appear later as a decay product, by carefully sampling a bit of calcite and measuring the ratio of uranium to thorium. Scientists can estimate when that crust began to grow. If the calcite layer lies on top of a painting, sealing a red hand stencil or a black outline, that gives a minimum age. The art has to be older than the crust that covers it, because the pigment was there first, then the mineral grew across it like a glassy bandage. This is how some of the startlingly old dates from Sulawesi and from Iberian caves have been proposed. A calcite veil covering a pig figure or a ladder-like sign is dated to, say, 43,000 or 64,000 years ago. The image beneath must predate that moment, even if only by a season, perhaps by centuries. But there are limits. Uranium-thorium tells you when that particular crust started to form, not when the pigment was laid down to the day or even the millennium. It can't reach through the calcite and say, the artist painted this precisely 1,000 years before the drip began. It also depends on the calcite having behaved as a closed system. No later water washing extra uranium in or out. No microscopic fractures letting things move around. If the system was disturbed, the age can be off. So when you hear a Uranium-Series date, it is usually framed carefully. At least this old, not necessarily exactly this old. A floor, not a ceiling. On the other side of the spectrum is radiocarbon dating, which deals not with mineral crusts but with once living matter. Charcoal is the obvious target. Many cave paintings, especially black drawings and shaded forms, are made with charcoal from burned wood or bone. When a plant is alive, it takes in carbon, including a small proportion of radioactive carbon-14. After it dies and is burned and ground into pigment, that carbon-14 decays at a regular rate, like a very slow clock winding down. If a painting was made with pure charcoal, and if a tiny sample can be taken from a line or shaded area without destroying the image, radiocarbon dating can estimate when the wood that made the charcoal stopped living. That gives a rough age for the pigment itself. Again, the method has boundaries. Radiocarbon becomes less precise as you go further back. Beyond about 50,000 years, there is so little carbon-14 left that the signal fades into noise. Charcoal can also be reused. A branch that lay dead for a few centuries might be burned and turned into paint later, making the radiocarbon age slightly older than the act of painting. Contamination is another problem. Even a bit of recent carbon, touch from a modern hand, soot from a later torch, can pull the apparent date forward in time. Because of this, radiocarbon ages are usually given with ranges, not exact points. Calibrated curves, error bars, probabilities perhaps between 33,500 and 35,200 years ago, at 1 or 2 standard deviations of confidence. A window of time rather than a single birthday. Neither method on its own is perfect. That's why archaeologists lean heavily on context. The cave floor tells its own story in layers. This is stratigraphy, the same principle that lets geologists read cliffs and riverbanks. Sediments accumulate, dust, ash, broken stalactites, fallen stones, the compacted remnants of old cave floors. People leave things behind in those layers, hearths full of charcoal and cracked bone, discarded stone tools, lumps of ochre and manganese, trampled footprints that harden in mud and are then sealed over. If a hearth can be radiocarbon dated to 29,000 years ago, and that hearth lies in a layer that clearly underlies a panel of paintings, perhaps the wall shows a smear of smoke from those same fires, overlain by figures, then the art is younger than the hearth. If another layer above the same panel contains tools or bones dated to 24,000 years ago, the paintings likely fall somewhere between. Not a precise date, but a bracket. Sometimes the logic runs the other way. If a fallen slab covered in paintings is buried in sediments that date to 18,000 years ago, the art must be older than the collapse that entombed it. If calcite stalagmites grew over a painted floor, and those stalagmites can be dated with Uranium-Series, they too provide a minimum. The painting is older than the first growth of the stone that seals it. Each of these clues comes with its own error bars. Radiocarbon might give you a span of several hundred years. Uranium-Series might carry uncertainties of a few % of the age. So archaeologists talk in terms of ranges, minimums, maximums. At least this old, no younger than this. Probably between these two horizons. The real confidence comes when different methods converge. A calcite crust over a hand stencil gives a minimum age. A hearth on the floor below, rich in the same pigment and dated by radiocarbon, gives a maximum. The two brackets overlap. The style of the art matches other dated panels elsewhere. The stone tools in the same levels belong to a known technological tradition that has its own spread in time. Slowly the fog lifts. Not completely, there are always gaps, always arguments at the edges, but enough to turn a timeless image on stone into an event in history. Enough to say by the time these horses were painted, the ice sheets had reached this far. When this aurochs took shape on the wall, Neanderthals had already vanished from this region. Or perhaps they had not. Once you have those anchors, you can start asking deeper questions. What exactly were these ancient artists using to make such durable colours? How did they take earth and ash and turn them into images that could outlast glaciers and species alike? To answer that, you have to follow the colour back to its source. Most of the reds and yellows in the world's oldest cave art come from a family of minerals we group under one soft name, ochre. In reality, it's a spectrum of iron-rich earths, hematite for deep reds, goethite for yellows and browns, mixed oxides for intermediate shades. These minerals form where iron-bearing rocks weather and rust, where groundwater moves slowly through sediments, where clays and sands quietly stain themselves over geological time. For an Ice Age artist, ochre wasn't rare, but good ochre was not everywhere. Some deposits are crumbly faint, more brown than red. Others, when broken, reveal a dense, waxy interior that grinds into an intense, almost oily pigment. Archaeologists find these pieces in caves, nodules with flat facets, cut and scraped, stones with grooved sides where someone has dragged the same lump of colour again and again, shaving off powder. Black had its own sources. Charcoal from burned wood or bone gave a soft velvety black that could be smeared or brushed. Manganese oxides, black metallic minerals, often found in veins and nodules, produced a colder bluish black when ground. In some caves, those rich black lines you see, bison outlines, horse manes, hand silhouettes, turn out under a microscope to be mostly manganese, not soot at all. That means someone at some point learned to recognize and collect these heavy dark stones and understood that inside them there was a different kind of night. Between red and black lay all the subtle greys and browns built from mixtures. Charcoal dulled with ochre, manganese softened with clay from the cave floor. Rarely there are hints of white, ground calcite, scraped chalk, or simply the natural pale of the limestone left unpainted, carefully preserved as a highlight. Once you have the raw material, you still need to turn stone into paint. Grinding is the first step that leaves a clear archaeological fingerprint. In living sites near painted caves, and sometimes inside the caves themselves, thin slabs of rock show polished central hollows, stained red, yellow, or black. These are grinding stones. Pigment nodules from the same layers often show matching curves, smoothed facets where they were rubbed again and again to raise a fine powder. The presence of very fine, evenly sized pigment grains on walls suggests more than casual crushing. Under magnification, some paint layers show a consistent texture, like flour rather than gravel. That kind of fineness doesn't happen by accident if you just smash rocks once or twice. It implies time spent grinding, perhaps with different tools, initial pounding, then slower circular motions, until the mix behaved the way the painter wanted. Then comes mixing. Dry powder alone does not cling easily to stone. To make it stick, to turn dust into stroke, you almost certainly need a binder or a wetting agent. Water will carry pigment, but it dries fragile, so archaeologists have looked for other traces: fat, marrow, blood, plant gums, egg, even milk. Organic binders don't usually survive tens of thousands of years in the thin layers of a painting, but occasionally chemical signatures hint that something more than water was involved. Some experiments with replica paints suggest that mixing ochre with animal fat creates a rich, creamy paste that adheres well and remains vivid. Blood darkens colour, plant resins add gloss and hardness, saliva increases spreadability. We may never know exactly what a given cave painter added to their bowl, but the very existence of durable, unfaded surfaces in damp, unstable environments points toward recipes that were tested, remembered, and repeated. Application leaves its own record, written in tool marks and spray patterns rather than words. Most hand stencils, those ghostly negatives of fingers and palms, appear to have been made by pressing a hand to the rock and blowing pigment around it. Sometimes the spray is fine and uniform, sometimes it's coarse, with little droplets radiating outward. In many cases, analysis shows that the pigment was blown directly from the mouth, not from a reed or hollow bone. The distribution of droplets, their size and force, the angles they make around knuckles, all fit with a human mouth close to the rock, lips pursed, pigment-laden liquid or powder carried on a breath. Other markings suggest simple tools. Soft pads, perhaps made of moss, fur, or chewed plant fibres, seem to have been dabbed and pressed onto the wall to fill in large coloured areas. The paint forms clustered, overlapping patches, each with a slightly rounded edge, like the imprint of a sponge. And then there are lines that could only have been made with something like a brush. Thin black strokes that vary in thickness along their length, swelling when the tool pressed harder, tapering as pressure eased. In microscopic view, the edges feather slightly, individual pigment particles lie in narrow trails, as if dragged. No single brush survives, but the marks behave like those made with bundles of hair or plant fibres bound together, flexible enough to curve and respond to the hand. Sometimes you can see correction. A line begins, wavers, is darkened again, or a shape is outlined twice, as if the first attempt did not satisfy the eye that made it. That tells us the painter could stand back, by the light of hearth or fat lamp, and judge the effect, then adjust technique, add more pigment, smooth an edge. It wasn't just gesture, it was revision. Behind all of this lies a quieter question. Where did they get their colours, and how far were they willing to go to find them? In some caves, geological surveys show that the pigments used match local deposits, easily accessible within a short walk. A nearby stream bank rich in ochre, a cliff with manganese nodules exposed. In those places, the art may reflect opportunistic use of what the land offered. A group could camp near a cave, collect colour as needed, and paint over days or seasons without storing much. Elsewhere, the story looks different. The exact mineral signature of pigments in certain European caves does not match the immediate bedrock, but lines up with sources tens of kilometres away. Lumps of high-quality ochre and manganese turn up in living sites far from any natural outcrop carried in with other goods. This suggests that people were selecting specific deposits, perhaps ones known in their traditions for strong colour or easy grinding, and transporting them as part of their mobile toolkit. For highly mobile hunter-gatherers, hauling heavy stones is not done lightly. To carry a kilogram of dense red earth across a mountain pass means giving up some other weight, less meat, fewer bones, one less tool blank. When a group makes that choice, it tells us something about their priorities. Pigment was not just a casual extra, it was important enough to trade for, to seek out, to keep safe as they moved. This too ties back into networks. Some groups may have specialised in particular sources, exchanging rare colours along the same paths that carried shells, fine stone, and stories. A red streak in one cave might share its mineral fingerprint with a streak hundreds of kilometres away, hinting that people, ideas, and materials flowed together. By the time a handprint blooms on stone or a bison steps forward in black and red, an entire chain of decisions and skills has already unfolded. From noticing a coloured rock on a hillside, to grinding and mixing it just so, to choosing how to lay it down. The images feel immediate, but they rest on chemistry, memory, and quiet practice. And once those materials are in hand, literally and figuratively, another question arises: whose hands were they? Who leaned close to the wall, blew pigment from their lungs, or guided a brush across the curves of the rock? Some of the oldest answers we have are not animals or symbols at all, but hands. In caves from Spain to Sulawesi, Argentina to France, you see them pale silhouettes edged in red or black, fingers spread, palms flattened against stone. Technically they're not prints but negatives, made with that blown pigment we just followed. The hand acts as a mask, the colour coats the rock around it, and when the hand pulls away, a ghost remains. The technique is simple enough that almost anyone could learn it. You mix pigment with water or fat, take some into your mouth, place your hand on the rock, and exhale in a controlled burst. Repeat, adjusting the distance and angle until the outline is solid. It's quick. A single stencil might take seconds, but what looks effortless on the wall is sitting on top of everything we've already seen. The collecting, grinding and mixing, the decision to bring colour into this space at all. What's striking is not just that this method appears in many caves, but that some of the very oldest images we know are hand stencils. In Sulawesi, a red outline of a hand dates to at least 40,000 years ago, and possibly more. In Spain, another cluster of stencils may push toward that same age range. On other continents, similar forms appear later, but the shared idea is unmistakable. Use your own body as a template. Use breath as your tool. Leave a shape that is both you and not you. Because they're fairly numerous, and because hands are surprisingly informative, scientists have tried to read more out of them than just "someone was here." Human hands are not all the same. The relative lengths of fingers, the width of the palm, the thickness of the wrist, these features vary with age, sex, and individual development. In the last few decades, researchers have traced measurements on hundreds of ancient stencils, comparing finger ratios to modern population data to see if any patterns emerge. Some studies, especially on European caves, suggest that many of the stencils cluster in ranges more typical of women than men. Others show a mix, some obviously larger, broader hands, and some much smaller, even child-sized. In a few caves, you can see tiny hands nested among bigger ones, like nesting dolls of generations or social roles. But the picture is not neat. Our reference data sets come from modern people living different lives with different nutrition and activity. Bone and soft tissue can shape hands in ways we don't fully understand for Ice Age populations. So, while it's tempting to declare, "These are women" or "These are children," caution is warranted. At best, the measurements suggest diversity, multiple kinds of bodies participating in the act of making. Variation shows up in other ways too. Some hands are missing fingers, not in reality but in the stencil. One or more fingers are folded under, leaving only stumps of colour around the remaining ones. In some traditions, finger amputation marks grief or vows. In others, folded fingers might code for numbers, names, or clans. In these caves, we don't know. It could be a genuine record of injury. It could be a sign language in pigment. It could be as simple as play. What were these hands for? One possibility is the most intuitive. They are signatures. Not in the modern legal sense, but in the deeper sense of saying, "I was here. I am part of this place." When you press your hand on a wall and surround it with colour, you fuse body and stone, however briefly. The rock keeps the outline long after the bone is gone. Another idea is that they mark belonging at a group level. If certain caves belonged in the stories of particular lineages or bands, the walls might carry what archaeologists sometimes call clan markers, repeated motifs that stand for a group identity. A row of similar hands or a combination of hand positions and nearby symbols could be a way of anchoring those affiliations in a shared, visible form. Hand stencils also lend themselves well to rites of passage. The act is physical, a bit intimate, perhaps even uncomfortable pigment in the mouth, cold stone under the palm, the sound of breath against rock. You could imagine a young person brought into the cave at a certain age, guided to a clear patch of wall and told to add their hand to the growing constellation. A record not just of their face or name, but of the moment they crossed some invisible threshold in the group's eyes. And then there is the idea of participation. In caves where animals and signs dominate, hand stencils sometimes cluster around major panels, like a quiet chorus framing the main scene. In others they appear on their own, in dense clusters, as if the hand itself was enough. Perhaps the hand was a way for people who were not primary painters, the specialists who outlined horses or bison, to still take part in the ceremonial use of the cave. The wall becomes a register of attendance, of witnessed events, rather than a gallery of individual artists. Where these hands appear inside the cave adds another layer. Some stencils are just inside the entrance, in places that would have been lit by daylight or by a single fire without much effort. They could be seen frequently, passed by on the way in and out, part of everyday movement between outside and inside worlds. Others are far deeper, in tight passages or high ceilings that require climbing or scaffolding. Reaching them would have taken planning, tools, and shared effort. This distribution hints at different functions. Hands near entrances might lean more toward everyday identity, markers for anyone who came and went. Deep hands might be tied to rarer rituals, performances, or restricted gatherings. The deeper you go, the more the cave enforces a kind of selection. Not everyone can or will make that journey. A stencil in a cramped, distant chamber may carry a different social weight than one at shoulder height near the light. Still, we have to live with uncertainty. The same hand in the same spot could carry more than one meaning at once. It could be a signature and a rite of passage, a clan mark and a trace of a private moment of bravery in the dark. The people who made them were capable of layered thought. Their symbols need not be simple. What we can say, cautiously, is the hands on the wall bring us closer to the makers than almost any other form. Animals may tell us what they watched and hunted. Abstract signs may hint at systems of meaning we only half grasp. But a hand is the scale of a handshake, the span of a touch. It reminds us that behind every bison, every line of dots, there was a living body at arm's length from the stone. And once you notice the hands, you start to see that they share the wall with other presences, the animals themselves, painted and engraved, crowding the same spaces, watching and watched in return. Once you've met the hands, your eyes keep drifting to what surrounds them. Animals, everywhere. Bison layered over bison, horses packed nose to flank in flowing lines. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, ibex, aurochs, deer with antlers like rising trees. In some caves, it feels like every available surface has been claimed by something with hooves or horns, claws or tusks. Why animals, one answer, is almost too simple, but it's probably true. Because animals dominated their attention. For Ice Age people, big mammals weren't background scenery. They were food on the hoof, danger in the dark, competition at the waterhole, and moving symbols of power and beauty. If you lived in a world where a herd's migration could decide whether your children ate through the winter, your mind would be full of hooves and breath and muscle too. Animals concentrate many things at once: economy, risk, admiration, and very likely myth. The same bison you stalked on the plain might also be the hero of a story told by firelight, the ancestor of a clan, or a being with its own agency in a spirit-filled landscape. Drawing it on the wall is not just drawing a stake on legs. It's pulling all those layers into one visible form. What's painted also tells us where we are in the world and when. The species that show up most often in a cave tend to match the animals known from bones and pollen in the same region and time. In chilly Western Europe during certain Ice Age phases, you see the Great Cold Steppe cast: woolly rhinos, mammoths, reindeer, steppe bison, horses adapted to sparse grasslands. In milder intervals, red deer and aurochs become more common, along with forest-loving animals. When climates shifted, so did the fauna on the walls, at least in broad strokes. In some long-used caves, lower, older layers of painting lean toward one set of species, while higher, later layers introduce or favour others. The rock becomes a kind of ecological diary, an echo of larger changes in ice sheets and vegetation. In Sulawesi, those early pig deer and wild bovids are precisely the creatures that would have haunted the tropical forests and limestone hills nearby. In later European caves, you see more specialised mountain animals in regions where rocky uplands dominated the landscape. People painted what lived with them and around them, and sometimes what passed through only at certain times of year. That last detail leads to something subtle: seasonality. Many of the animals chosen were not just present, but highly seasonal in their behaviour. Reindeer and some horse populations migrated in mass, predictable waves. Bison gathered in large herds at particular times. Salmon ran in rivers. For hunters, these cycles were like moving calendars. Miss the window and your best chance for calories was gone. On some cave walls, the recurring focus on certain life stages, antlers in velvet, rutting males, pregnant mares, birds in particular plumages, has led researchers to suggest that these images might be keyed to seasons. Antlers fully grown might correspond to late summer or autumn. Certain combinations of animals might evoke, if not a written calendar, at least a remembered cycle. This is the time of bison. That is the time of reindeer. If that's right, then the paintings are not just decoration, but a way of holding time still. The herd that appears once a year can be made to appear again and again, whenever the torchlight falls. The way different animals are treated on the walls hints at something else. Not all creatures were equal. Pre-species horses, bison, deer are often numerous, rendered in large panels with bodies that follow the bulges and dips of the rock. They may be pierced by abstract signs, overlaid with lines, surrounded by dots. Predators, when they appear, lions, bears, wolves, big cats, tend to be fewer, sometimes more isolated, sometimes lurking at the edges of compositions. Their poses can be more tense, more frontal, less engulfed in the swirling mass of herd animals. It's as if prey belonged to the shared, open drama of daily life, chased, watched, counted, while predators belong to a different narrative layer, rarer, more dangerous, perhaps more symbolically charged. You might see 20 horses in a panel and a single lion placed apart. That imbalance could mirror reality. Many grazers, few apex hunters. It could also mirror emotion, generalized familiarity versus concentrated fear and awe. There's also the puzzle of what's missing. In some regions, small game, rabbits, birds, fish, likely made up a noticeable chunk of the diet, based on bones in campsites. Yet they are underrepresented on cave walls. Plants, which were almost certainly crucial to survival, are almost entirely absent or extremely schematic. This mismatch between what they ate and what they painted suggests that diet alone cannot explain the art. People chose to depict what gripped their imagination, not just what filled their stomachs. A single huge aurochs bull might stand in for an entire field of tubers in terms of emotional impact. For a long time, one explanation tried to pull all of this together into a neat package, hunting magic. The idea is that by painting an animal, sometimes wounded, sometimes pierced by arrows or signs, people believed they could influence the real hunt, bind the soul of the prey, ensure success, increase herds, or control migration. There may be some truth here. In some ethnographic cases, hunter-gatherer art is tied to rituals that speak to prey spirits, ask permission, or rehearse the hunt in symbolic form. Some cave images do show animals in poses that look like they're being struck or falling. But as a complete explanation, hunting magic now seems too simple. Many of the most frequently painted animals don't line up cleanly with the most frequently eaten, at least where we can compare images and bone piles. Some scenes are so layered and abstracted that they're hard to read as straightforward hunting diagrams. Others show pregnant animals, mating animals, or peaceful herds with no hint of weapons at all. If these were manuals for killing, they are strangely roundabout. It's possible that what we call magic here is part of a broader relationship. Gratitude rituals to animals that give themselves, stories about first hunts and mythical herds, teachings about which species belong to which landscape features. The cave in that view becomes a place where the community's entire relationship with animal life is charted, not just the moment of the kill. So when you lie here and picture those walls, you can imagine a few things with some confidence. The people who made these paintings lived in close, unbroken contact with the animals they depicted. The choice of species reflects the climates they endured and the landscapes they moved through. The rhythms of migration and breeding likely structured their years and bled into their stories. Predators and prey occupied different emotional and symbolic spaces in their minds. But beyond meat and fur, beyond danger and utility, animals seem to have given them a language of forms, horns, hooves, flanks, eyes that could carry meanings we can only half guess. In the next part, when those animals begin to cluster into scenes, to face each other, to combine with signs and human shapes, we'll step a little closer to what those meanings might have been, not just a bestiary on stone, but stories. If animals are the vocabulary, then the next question is whether any of these walls contain sentences. What counts as a scene? At first glance, it seems simple. If you see several figures together, they must be part of the same story. But archaeologists have learned to be cautious. In many caves, paintings were added and reworked over centuries, even millennia. One bison might be 30,000 years older than the horse painted across its flank. What looks like a single busy tableau may actually be a slow-motion accumulation of separate moments, stacked like translucent pages. So researchers try to distinguish between proximity and composition. Separate images in proximity are just that. Figures that happen to be near each other without any clear interaction. Maybe they're painted in different colours, at slightly different scales with different levels of skill. Their outlines cross, but they don't seem to respond to one another. Like strangers on a crowded bus, they share space without sharing a narrative. A scene, in contrast, is when the images begin to behave as if they belong together. Bodies tilt toward a common point. A line of animals moves in the same direction, as if part of a herd. A human figure seems to reach toward or merge with a beast. Symbols cluster around one creature, but not its neighbour. The rock surface itself might be chosen so that a natural bulge becomes the belly of a pregnant horse, while a crack becomes a spear or a wound. These are hints that the artist was thinking in terms of relationships, not just isolated figures. There are a few places where this becomes almost unavoidable. In the French cave of Lascaux, there is the so-called shaft scene, a bison with its entrails hanging out, a bird on a stick, and a figure that looks vaguely human, lying or falling, with a bird-like head and an erect, exaggerated phallus. Nearby there's a rhinoceros. This arrangement is not random bison business as usual. It feels staged like a frozen moment in some myth or remembered event, a disastrous hunt, a shamanic trance, a story of death and transformation. Scholars argue over the details, but almost no one thinks these figures are unrelated. Elsewhere, in both Europe and Indonesia, there are panels that have been read as group hunts. Lines of small human shapes flank or surround larger animals. In Sulawesi, at one very early site, tiny part human figures with what look like animal heads appear to be driving or confronting pig, deer and wild cattle. Some researchers see this as a narrative hunt scene, perhaps even involving beings that blur the line between human and animal, spirits, shamans in disguise, or characters from a story. There are also panels that feel more like ceremonies than chases. In a few caves, humanish figures stand facing each other or facing an imposing animal with abstract signs hovering nearby. One famous panel in France shows a row of bison and horses above, while below more enigmatic shapes, rectangles, branching lines, dots, cluster around a central figure. To some eyes it looks like a ritual gathering, or at least an arrangement where the animals are not the only focus. The wall becomes a kind of stage, with upper and lower registers, like the stacked scenes on an ancient temple relief. These are the places where imagination wants to sprint ahead and fill in dialogue. You can almost hear someone saying, "This is when the bison killed the hunter," or "Here is the time the spirits appeared as pigs and cattle," or "These are the people standing before the great animal who made the river." It is very tempting to see full stories here, beginnings, middles, endings. But there's a risk. We are narrative animals, raised on novels, movies, and comics. Our brains are wired to connect dots into plots, even when no plot is there. Modern viewers may be imposing story structure that wasn't intended. 3 animals in a line might be 3 separate memories, not a chase. A human figure next to a wounded bison might be a symbol of identity, our group and its animal, rather than a literal scene of spearing. What looks to us like a carefully composed panel might, to the people who used the cave, have been more like a crowded notice board, added to whenever someone had a reason. So researchers look for repetition. If certain combinations of figures and signs recur across different caves and regions, the same kind of animal paired with the same geometric mark, positioned in similar ways, then it becomes more plausible that we're dealing with shared conventions, maybe even recurring episodes in oral traditions. Repeated motifs can work like memory aids or like titles. Imagine a panel dominated by a large, twisting horse with a particular pattern of dots near its head. If that configuration appears again elsewhere, many miles away, it might serve as a visual prompt. When the storyteller points to it, everyone knows which tale is being invoked. "This is the horse with the dots," they might say, and a flood of associated images, sounds, and lessons would come to mind, even if none of that is actually visible on the wall. In that sense, the caves might not hold full stories so much as anchors for stories. The rock cannot carry the entire narrative, but it can hold key images that stabilize memory. The dangerous hunt gone wrong, the first meeting with a certain animal, the origin incident that explains why a clan honors a particular species. Oral traditions are powerful but fragile. They depend on repetition and cues. A specific panel in a specific chamber could be the place you go generation after generation to visit a story, to refresh it in the mind of the community. Some anthropologists use the phrase social memory here. These images would not just be individual sketches, but shared reference points, agreed upon symbols of experiences that mattered to the group. When children were brought into the deep chambers, elders might have traced the outlines with their fingers, not just to admire the art, but to pull whole narratives back into circulation. From this perspective, the question, "Are we seeing stories on stone?" has a cautious answer. We are probably not seeing stories in the way we expect. No clear sequences, no comic strip panels marching from left to right. But we may be seeing the nodes around which stories clustered. We may be looking at the durable skeletons of tales that were fleshed out with voice, gesture, and song. The hard part is that the voice is gone. The gesture is gone. Only the bones remain. So as you drift, you can imagine standing in a dark chamber with a small circle of people. An elder lifts a torch toward a panel where animals and signs gather in deliberate patterns. For them, this wall is not mute. It is crowded with remembered events and sacred narratives. For us, it is almost silent, but not entirely. The repetition of forms, the careful staging of certain figures, the way some panels gather attention more than others, all hint that stone was being used to do something more than decorate. It was helping a small, vulnerable species remember who they were, where they had been, and what had happened long before any of them were born. If some panels feel like the skeletons of stories, then the next question is, what about the parts of the caves that don't look like stories at all? What do we do with the dots, the dashes, the ladders, the little boxes and zigzags? For a long time, these non-figurative marks were treated as background noise. The real art was the animals and the rare human figures. The rest, tiny clusters of spots, Lines scratched or painted in rows, bracket shapes, chevrons, grids, were often dismissed as random doodles or simple decoration. But when researchers started cataloguing them carefully across multiple sites and regions, patterns began to emerge. In French and Spanish caves you see repeated signs, rows of red or black dots, sometimes forming a line that seems to follow the curve of a wall. There are ladder-like motifs, two vertical lines connected by shorter horizontal rungs, rectangles with internal divisions like boxes with shelves, triangles and chevrons, those V-shaped marks that march along a surface in groups, branching lines like simplified trees or forks, tally-like strokes that cluster in little groups of 3, 4, 5. Similar shapes appear again and again, from site to site over thousands of years. They are not identical, no prehistoric font was being used, but they rhyme. A ladder here, a ladder there. A particular kind of bracket sign near horses in one cave, and again near bison in another. A fan of dots positioned at the entrance to one chamber, and a nearly matching fan painted beside a narrow passage somewhere else. Once you notice this, it becomes harder to see them as random. So people begin to ask, could this be some kind of visual code? Not writing in the modern sense. No one has found anything like a full alphabet or clear sentences, but perhaps a limited system of signs that carried agreed upon meanings within a group or a family of groups. There are a lot of possibilities. One idea is counting. Those rows of dots and short lines could be tallies, records of hunts, phases of the moon, seasons or ritual events. Recently, a researcher has argued that certain combinations of dots and Y-shaped marks near animals might represent something like reproductive calendars, a way to track mating seasons or birthing periods for key species. If that were true, these signs would be practical notes as well as symbolic ones. This is when the salmon return. This is when the bison calves are born. Another proposal is that some signs functioned as calendars in a broader sense. Imagine a community that needs to remember when to move to a particular valley, when certain plants ripen, when rivers are likely to flood. Instead of writing down dates, they could anchor those cycles to recurring marks on stone. A certain grid near a cave entrance might say in their terms, "This is the time of splitting paths, the moment in the year when groups separate to follow different herds." A cluster of chevrons might stand for the return of birds or the coming of rains. Others think some of these signs are more like maps. A line with branching offshoots could mirror a river and its tributaries. A box divided into compartments might echo the structure of a campsite or a favourite hunting ground with its known hiding places. When the same pattern shows up again miles away, it could be a way for visitors from another band to recognise that this is also our place, or the people who use this cave follow paths like ours. Then there are trance marks. People who study altered states of consciousness notice that certain basic geometric patterns, grids, zigzags, radiating stars, are commonly reported in visions, whether induced by fasting, drumming, or plant substances. Some researchers have suggested that at least part of the non-figurative repertoire in caves might come from such inner experiences. A shaman or visionary sees a field of pulsing chevrons or a spinning lattice and later records that sensation on the wall. In that reading, the signs are less about counting or mapping the external world, and more about charting journeys into an invisible one. There's also the possibility of social markers. Repeated signs might act as group identifiers, clan emblems, or personal signatures. A certain ladder sign might say, "This panel belongs to us," or "We were here." A specific arrangement of dots could indicate the participation of a particular lineage in a ritual, the way heraldic symbols once did on shields and banners. When you find the same sign in widely separated caves, it might mean that members of that group ranged over a large territory or that their symbol was adopted by allies. The tricky part is that the same motif could have served several functions at once. A clan mark could also carry calendrical associations. A trance pattern might be used over time as a way of counting. Culture tends to layer meanings rather than keep them in neatly labelled boxes. Placement matters too. A row of dots floating alone on a blank wall may not mean the same thing as a row of dots painted directly over a horse's flank. A ladder sign at the very threshold of a deep passage, just where the light begins to fail, might act as a threshold marker, a cue that you're crossing into a different sort of space, perhaps more dangerous, more sacred, or reserved for particular rituals. The same sign placed casually near the entrance where everyone comes and goes might function more like a public notice. When symbols cluster around certain animals, it raises further questions. If a particular grid appears only beside bison, or a specific chevron pattern appears reliably near mammoths, then it becomes tempting to see those shapes as tags, labels, or commentaries about the species depicted. Maybe they indicate the season associated with that animal, or the type of ritual conducted in its honour, or the way it is hunted or avoided. If the same mark appears near a narrow passage, it might evoke the same story or taboo that the animal embodies. Archaeologists have begun to map these associations statistically, comparing where signs appear, which animals they accompany, and which parts of caves they favour. Some correlations look promising, others dissolve under closer scrutiny. There is intrigue, but not yet consensus, and that is where the caution returns. The recurrence of ladders, grids, dots, and chevrons across regions is suggestive. It hints at shared conventions, transmitted over long distances and longer times. But recurrence alone does not unlock meaning. Two groups may draw the same sign and think very different thoughts. Even within a single culture, the meaning of a symbol can drift over centuries. What we can say, without pushing too far, is that these marks reveal a comfort with abstraction. Whoever made them was willing to detach meaning from literal depiction. They could let a pattern of lines stand for something else, a time, a place, a group, a state of mind, an event. They were building a layer of mental life in which shapes could refer, not just resemble. It isn't writing as we know it. There is no clear grammar, no sequence that we can pass like a sentence. But it may be something like a distant ancestor of graphic notation, a way of using repeated signs to stabilize memory, coordinate behavior, and signal ideas that cannot be easily drawn as animals or people. In the glow of a dim flame, a row of dots or a small ladder might have been as charged with meaning for them as a written word is for us. For us, they sit in the quiet half-light of uncertainty, familiar shapes, carrying messages we can sense, but not yet read. Those unreadable signs bring us to another puzzle that runs through almost every famous site. Why here? Not just why this valley, this cliff, this entrance in the rock, but why this particular chamber, 200, 500, sometimes more than 1,000 feet from daylight? Because if you've ever been inside a real cave, not the tourist path with lights and railings, but the untouched dark, you know something important. None of this was convenient. Once you leave the entrance glow behind, the world changes fast. The floor becomes uneven, slick with clay or dusted with loose stones. Passages narrow, ceilings drop. There are sudden pits, sharp drops, pools of cold water. The air cools, and depending on the cave, it can get stale. Oxygen levels in deep galleries sometimes dip just enough to leave you lightheaded if you stay too long, especially near smouldering fires. Lose your way, lose your light, and you're in trouble. There is no night vision in that darkness. Human eyes do not adjust. It is an absolute black, like closing your eyes and then closing them again. So if people went in there, they had to plan it. They needed light they could trust, They used torches, bundled sticks or twists of resinous wood carried in the hand or fixed in cracks in the wall. They carved small stone lamps, shallow cups of limestone or sandstone, filled them with animal fat, and laid wicks of moss or plant fibre inside. Burned properly, those little lamps can give a soft, steady glow for hours. Fuel had to be gathered in advance. Wood, fat, perhaps resin, all collected outside, carried in with them, used carefully so it didn't run out at the worst moment. Some caves preserve the remains. Blackened torch ends dropped on the floor. Lampstones still stained with soot and grease. In a few places you can trace their route by the rhythm of fire. A torch mark on this wall, another a few metres ahead, a lamp niche at a crossroads where they might have paused to decide which way to go. Navigation wasn't simple either. Many decorated caves are mazes. Passages fork and twist back on themselves. Some routes require crawling or squeezing sideways between bulges of rock. In certain French caves, ancient footprints press into soft clay far from the entrance, adults, and sometimes the smaller impressions of children, showing exactly where they walked, where they turned, where they stopped. In a famous case at Touques-d'Audubert in France, a line of prints leads through a narrow, winding corridor to a hidden chamber where two clay bison stand, carefully modelled by hand. The footprints belong to a young person, perhaps an adolescent, walking barefoot in the mud. You can follow their steps, feel the bends and low ceilings through the rhythm of those marks. They were not wandering at random, they were going somewhere. So why put the art there, at the end of demanding paths instead of near the entrance, where daylight reaches and life happens? The easy answer is they didn't always. Many caves have markings near the mouth, engravings, painted panels, hand stencils, set in places everyone in the group could have seen day after day. Those entrance zone images feel almost like public art. They might have been part of ordinary comings and goings, visible during tool-making, food processing, sheltering from storms. Deeper in, the mood shifts. The further you go from the light, the more every step becomes a choice. Fewer people can fit in narrow passages. Fires use more fuel. Risk rises, a sprained ankle, a dropped torch, smoke building in a low pocket. You don't drag the entire band into those spaces casually. Anthropologists sometimes talk about liminal zones, threshold places that are neither fully one thing nor the other. Deep cave chambers are a physical version of that. They sit between worlds, not quite surface, not yet the underworld of water tables and rock. You must cross constrictions, squeeze through stone gates, descend or climb, listening as the air changes, the sounds dull or echo. Those transitions may not have been just physical. They may have carried meaning. Some researchers suggest that the deepest panels mark spaces reserved for particular rituals, restricted gatherings, or intense experiences, initiations, trance states, encounters with ancestors or spirits. The difficulty of reaching them would have reinforced their specialness. You had to endure the cold, the dark, the enclosed spaces to arrive. The journey itself could have been part of the ceremony. Caves also have voices. In places like Lascaux and Chauvet, decorated walls often appear in spots with striking acoustics. A clap or chant there can boom and linger. A low voice can fill the chamber. Tests with sound equipment show that echoes are strongest exactly where paintings cluster, while nearby blank walls remain acoustically ordinary. It is tempting to imagine our ancestors noticing this, choosing to paint where the rock seemed to answer back. Privacy might have mattered too. In a world without locks or doors, depth and difficulty are natural filters. Art in the innermost ring of a cave would not be visible to strangers or casual visitors. It would be experienced only by those in the know, those who were invited or allowed to undertake the journey. In that sense, deep galleries may have been something like sanctuaries or inner rooms, compared with the more open everyday art near entrances. The traces they left help us reconstruct all this. Soot stains on ceilings show where torches were lifted high to inspect an overhang. Charcoal smears on walls speak of hands groping in the dark or testing a surface before painting. Clusters of calcified dripstone on top of black deposits reveal that fires burned in specific spots long before later formations grew over them. Footprints record more intimate scenes. In some caves, the prints of multiple individuals converge in front of a panel, spread out as if they were standing shoulder to shoulder. In others, only a single track reaches a remote alcove, suggesting a solitary visit. Sometimes you find the small steps of children alongside adults, hinting that certain deep spaces were not exclusively for grown ritual specialists, but part of shared experiences that bridged ages. Taken together, the hazards, the lighting, the roots traced in ash and mud, the message is consistent. Whatever these people were doing in the deep zones of caves, it was not accidental and it was not casual. The art in those inner chambers sits at the far end of a chain of decisions: to gather fuel, to organize a group, to accept danger, to walk into the black and make the stone speak. The next question is how they did that. In practice, how much planning, skill and cooperation it actually took to turn rough rock into luminous herds and living walls. If you stand in front of one of those walls, even in photographs, you can feel it almost immediately. This was not done in a hurry. The planning starts long before the first pigment touches rock. In some European caves, there's evidence that people built scaffolds or climbed natural ledges to reach high panels. Paintings and engravings float several meters above the floor, too high for anyone to reach from the ground, even with an arm outstretched. In places like Lascaux, researchers have found sockets and depressions that may have held wooden poles, as well as wear marks on ledges that could have served as platforms. To work up there in flickering light, you don't just leap and hope. You decide in advance what you're going to paint, gather the materials, arrange the lighting, and build the means to get yourself in front of the chosen surface. The surfaces themselves often show preparation. Many panels sit on rock that has been lightly scraped, smoothed or even polished with stone tools or hands before pigment was applied. Uneven bits are removed, chalky crusts taken off. Sometimes you can see faint, almost ghostly outlines beneath the final lines, as if the artist first traced a sketch, then came back to reinforce and refine. In other cases, engraved guidelines lie just under the paint, thin incisions that set the proportions or the flow of a figure. This is not the impulsive doodling of someone passing by. It's closer to an artist's workshop, transported into stone and darkness. The wall itself was a collaborator. Painters didn't treat the rock as a flat canvas. They paid close attention to bulges, ridges, cracks and hollows, allowing the natural relief to stand in for muscles, bellies, shoulders or haunches. A protruding knob of limestone might become the barrel of a horse's chest. A curved swell might form the flank of a bison. A deep recess might be turned into the open mouth of an animal, or the dark space behind a horn. When you shift your viewpoint, those contours change the image. As your torch or lamp moves, light slides across the relief, making the painted bodies seem to swell and contract, to step forward or fade back. Some panels use multiple overlapping outlines for legs or heads, so that in different positions of light, different lines become dominant. It can look like motion, galloping, turning, twisting, built into the stone itself. So even perspective in a simple sense is there. Not the mathematically strict perspective of Renaissance paintings, but an intuitive grasp of how foreshortening, overlap and partial views can suggest depth. Animals are often shown in twisted poses, bodies in profile, horns turned toward the viewer, heads slightly angled. This combination lets you see more than would be visible from a single real-world angle. It is as if the artist is saying, "You know this creature, you've walked around it. You understand how its parts go together, so I'll show you the most important aspects at once." These images are also not frozen in a single moment in time. Many panels have been layered and reworked across generations. A bison might be painted over an older horse. A mammoth might cut through earlier abstract signs. Some lines are sharp and dark, others faint and partly covered by calcite, still others interrupted by later engravings. Radiometric dates sometimes show hundreds or even thousands of years between different elements on a single wall. Corrections are visible if you look closely. An animal's leg may be redrawn slightly higher, a horn adjusted, a head shifted by a few centimetres, leaving the earlier version still visible as a pale echo. Darker pigments or thicker lines strengthen choices that were once tentative. Nearby, abandoned lines trail off, half-finished figures fade out. This suggests not only experimentation, but standards, a sense of what looked right and what did not, refined as people reviewed, critiqued, and amended each other's work. That brings us to the quiet chorus of hands behind the art. On many walls, different styles sit side by side. One bison might be stocky, with short legs and heavy contour lines, while another nearby is more elongated, drawn with lighter, confident strokes. Pigment recipes differ. Some animals are painted with fine-grained, carefully ground ochre that leaves a smooth, even tone, others with a coarser mixture that speckles and streaks. Hand stencils nearby come in a range of sizes, from small palms that might belong to older children or slight adults to large square hands with thick fingers. This variety points to multiple artists working under shared conventions. Across wide regions, the same ways of drawing certain animals repeat. The same curve to a horse's neck, the same way of indicating a bison's beard, the same stylized form of horns or tails. Even abstract signs, ladder-like marks, branching shapes, repeated dots, follow recognizable patterns from cave to cave, separated by valleys, rivers, sometimes mountain ranges. That kind of consistency suggests a visual language taught and learned within communities, perhaps passed along between them. To get to that level, people must have invested real time, not just in painting, but in practice. We don't have sketchbooks from the Ice Age, but the skill level implies they existed in some form, on pieces of bone, on hide, in sand, in memory. Young people might have learned by watching elders mix pigments, grind minerals, test them on scraps of stone. They may have traced lines with fingers or sticks, copying the shapes of animals long before they were allowed to add marks to the deep cave walls. Teaching would not have been optional. In small populations, knowledge dies easily. To maintain such a sophisticated tradition over centuries, each generation had to train the next, not only how to control line and colour, but how to navigate the cave, how to care for the fires, how to judge when a surface was worthy of a major image and when it was not. All this takes time, and time in a hunter-gatherer life is not free. Every hour in the cave is an hour not spent hunting, butchering, gathering, repairing tools, watching children, tending fires on the surface. For bands living close to the edge of subsistence, to pour that much effort into imagery suggests that the payoff, social, emotional, spiritual, was considered worth it. Planning the scaffold, preparing the wall, selecting the contours, cooperating on light and safety, layering new work over the old while respecting what came before. These are not the actions of lonely artists improvising in secret. They look more like coordinated projects, shared undertakings that involved knowledge, negotiation, and trust. In that sense, every painted panel is more than a picture. It's a record of a process, of minds thinking ahead, hands working together, and skills patiently carried across generations. To understand what that process meant in daily life, who gathered, who decided, who was allowed to touch the wall, we have to step back from the images themselves and ask a broader question. What kind of social world produces art like this? If you follow that question out into the campfire light, away from the cave wall, the outlines of their social world start to come into view. Art at this scale is a clue to how many people were around and what they were willing to do together. One or two individuals can scratch a figure into soft stone. But organising repeated visits into deep, dangerous spaces, bringing fuel, pigments, food, and sometimes children, implies a band large enough to spare people from immediate work and still feel secure. Most hunter-gatherer groups studied in recent times organise themselves into flexible units, a core band of perhaps 20 or 30 people, nested in a wider web of related bands that meet and separate with the seasons. The cave paintings fit that kind of pattern. A small group could carry out the actual painting, but behind them there has to be a larger community that accepts the time, sees the value, and remembers the stories attached to each image. Someone has to watch the hearths on the surface while others vanish underground. Someone has to mind the toddlers, tend the meat drying on racks, keep an eye on the weather, the predators, the rival groups. The existence of rich, long-lasting art traditions hints that they were not always on the brink of starvation. At least in some seasons or in some years, there must have been enough surplus of time and calories that a portion of the group could invest in something other than immediate survival, something cooperative, repeatable, and meaningful. It also raises the question of who exactly got to paint. Some researchers imagine specialists, people recognized as particularly skilled, who took on the main burden of making the images, just as some individuals might have been expert hunters, healers, or toolmakers. The variation in style, the evident mastery in certain panels could point this way. Perhaps only a few hands in each community were trusted to mark the deepest walls, and their names, if they had personal names like ours, might have been known for generations. Others prefer a more communal picture. Hand stencils, finger flutings in soft clay, simple marks near cave entrances may have been made by many different people. Adults, adolescents, even children. The division might not have been between artist and non-artist, but between roles on a particular occasion. Some individuals mixed pigments, others carried lamps. Some prepared the surfaces, a smaller number executed the main figures, adding the practiced lines that everyone else watched and discussed. It is possible that both models were true at once. Specialists for some tasks, shared participation for others. One person might be renowned for horses, another for bison. Someone else might be asked to place a particular sign, the way a respected elder is asked to speak certain words at rituals. Teaching would blur the boundaries, learners assisting, then trying, then eventually joining the ranks of those allowed to touch the central panels. The distribution of similar motifs across distant caves hints at something wider than a single band's tradition. Stylized horses in southwestern France resemble those hundreds of kilometers away. Certain abstract signs repeat across whole regions, keeping roughly the same form even as generations pass. On the other side of the world, in Sulawesi, animal outlines and hand stencils appear in patterns that echo European ones in spirit, if not in exact detail. How does that happen? One option is direct contact. People move, even in the Ice Age. Bands did not stay fixed forever. Marriages, alliances, and seasonal movements could carry ideas from valley to valley, mountain range to mountain range. A young woman who grew up seeing a particular way of drawing an aurochs might bring that habit into the group she married into. A visitor at a seasonal gathering could watch another band's painting ritual and absorb new motifs along with new friendships. Another possibility is slower, deeper migration. Over generations, groups might shift their territories following herds, rivers, or coastlines. As they moved, they would leave some places behind, arrive in others, and occasionally adopt or merge with local traditions. Motifs could spread like plant seeds caught in fur, not deliberately, but carried along with the people who used them. And then there is convergent thought. Humans everywhere watch the same kinds of bodies move. Herds running, predators stalking, birds wheeling. Certain simplifications may be natural to the way our visual brain works. The tendency to show a powerful animal in profile, to emphasize horns or backs or flanks, to mark counting or attention with rows of dots, might arise more than once in more than one place as different groups grappled with similar perceptual and symbolic problems. The evidence we have suggests all three processes were probably in play. Still, the shared patterns are strong enough in some regions that most archaeologists suspect real networks of interaction, loose, braided paths of kinship and exchange stretching over hundreds of kilometres. Along those paths moved not only flint and shells, pigments and ochre, but songs, stories and ways of drawing. Within that network, caves themselves may have taken on special social roles. Some likely served as seasonal meeting points, places bands returned to when the herds migrated through, when salmon ran upriver, when certain plants were ripe. At those times, the small everyday bands could expand briefly into larger gatherings, dozens perhaps more, allowing young people to find mates, healers to trade remedies, hunters to swap knowledge. Painting could be part of that seasonal rhythm. New figures added at each return, old ones retouched, stories retold in front of familiar animals on the wall. The cave became a kind of memory palace, storing the collective past of a cluster of bands, renewed every time they came together. Other caves, especially those near the edges of territories, might have been boundary markers. A group could claim a valley, a hunting ground, or a sacred spring by marking the nearby cave with its preferred signs and animals. The images would not be fences, but statements. We are here. These are our stories, our alliances, our dead. Neighbouring groups might recognise these marks, respect them, or contest them. The cave wall, silent but enduring, held the record. Not all the evidence of this social life lies deep underground. Portable art, engraved bones, carved figurines, decorated antler tools, pendants made from teeth or shells adds another layer to the picture. These are objects that move with people, worn on the body, carried in bags, passed from hand to hand. A particular style of pendant, a way of drilling holes, a favoured motif on a spear thrower can link distant sites just as clearly as a painted bison. Ornaments may have signalled identity, membership in a band, an age group, a ritual society. They could encode kin ties, achievements or obligations visible whenever people met away from the caves. A bead style shared across a region suggests people who, at minimum, saw each other often enough for fashions to spread. In some cases, raw materials for ornaments, marine shells far from the sea, rare stones from distant outcrops, testify to trade or long-distance travel, knitting separate communities into a wider world. When you put all of this together, the planning and skill, the repeated motifs, the shared signs, the combination of deep, fixed images and portable, moving ones, you begin to see the art as the surface of a much larger structure. Underneath it lies a social network, small groups cooperating closely, tied into wider alliances, ideas carried along marriage lines and trade paths, shared traditions strong enough to survive bad years, long journeys, and the slow turning of climate. The caves in that sense are like nodal points in an invisible web. They hold the thickest strands of tradition, the densest knots of meaning, but they are connected to campsites under the stars, to ornaments against the skin, to stories told around every hearth. And within that web, art is not a luxury added on top of life. It is one of the ways life itself is organized, who belongs, who remembers, and who returns when the seasons turn. From here, it's a small step from social bonds to something even less tangible, but just as powerful, the beliefs that might have animated those gatherings, the rituals that could have unfolded in the glow of those trembling lights. Once you start asking what people believed, the ground under your feet gets softer. We are no longer dealing with bones we can measure or pigments we can test, but with inner worlds that left only indirect traces on stone. Still, certain patterns in the caves have tempted generations of researchers to try to peer behind the images into the minds that made them. One influential idea is that many of these paintings are products of shamanism. In this model, some individuals in a community, call them shamans, healers, ritual specialists, entered altered states of consciousness. They might have done this through rhythmic dancing, chanting, hyperventilation, sleep deprivation, or plant substances where those were available. In such states, they were thought to journey into a spirit world, to meet animal powers, ancestors, or other forces, and then return with knowledge or healing. The cave, dark and echoing, becomes in this reading a kind of physical gateway to that other realm. The evidence that draws people to this interpretation is scattered but suggestive. Deep darkness, broken only by flickering lamps, can easily produce visual effects. After images, glittering patterns, the sense of movement where none exists. Repetitive motifs, grids, zigzags, clusters of dots bear a loose resemblance to the geometric forms that many people report in early stages of trance. Some walls layer animal upon animal, figures emerging and dissolving depending on how the light hits, the way shapes shift in a vivid dream. It is not hard to imagine a group processing slowly into such a space. Feet crunching on cave floor, voices low or chanting, shadows leaping on the rock. At the deepest point, a designated person might stand before a bulge in the wall that suggests a bison's flank or a horse's head, and, in the height of an altered state, trace the spirit they see there. The painted animal would then crystallize that encounter, fixing the invisible into a visible form the whole community could later approach, point to, and talk about. A second line of interpretation is totemism. Here, animals on the walls are not just powerful beings met in visions, but emblems of social groups, clans, lineages, or other units defined by descent and alliance. A bison clan might tell stories of descent from a primordial bison, or of a pact made long ago with that animal spirit. Members might use bison imagery on ornaments, tools, and caves to signal membership, obligations, and rights to particular territories or resources. In a totemic reading, a cave panel becomes something like a family archive and a banner at once. Different animals might stand for different groups who shared the region, intermarried, or gathered at the same seasonal meeting place. A particular combination of species on a wall could encode mythic relationships, rivalries, or alliances, visible only to those who knew the stories. A third line of thought emphasizes initiation rites. Some caves are difficult or dangerous to access, with passages that narrow, floors that drop away, or chambers you can only reach by crawling. In these spaces, researchers have imagined rites of passage, adolescents led into the dark, guided through fear and uncertainty, confronted with images that only initiates are allowed to see, hand stencils made by small hands or finger tracings at heights reachable only with help, are sometimes read as marks of those who underwent such rites. In this view, the cave is not simply a spirit world or clan archive, but a training ground in which children become adults, novices become full members of a ritual society. Altered states of consciousness fit neatly into this picture. Long periods in the dark, heightened emotion, the smell of smoke, the repetition of songs or stories, all of these can change the way the brain processes experience. For a young person, The first encounter with thundering animal panels under those conditions might feel overwhelming, even transformative. The memory would anchor their new status in the group. The appeal of these models, shamanism, totemism, initiation, is obvious. They link the sensory power of the caves with rich, meaningful social practices. They explain why so much effort would be poured into places where nobody lived, why certain chambers were revisited for centuries, why some images seem deliberately hidden or hard to see. They resonate with ethnographic accounts of hunter-gatherers and small-scale societies in many parts of the world, where animals, spirits, and sacred places are tightly bound together in daily life. But there are important cautions. Most of the detailed shamanic and totemic systems we know about are from the last few centuries, in contexts already shaped by farming, metal, and contact with state societies. Projecting those complex cosmologies backward tens of thousands of years risks turning living peoples into time machines for our convenience. Even within recent hunter-gatherer groups, beliefs vary enormously across short distances and change over time. The material record, by contrast, is blunt. We see images, not prayers. We see repeated motifs, not the rules that governed who could see them, or what was said in front of them. A narrow passage might have been a place of ordeal, or simply the only route to a chamber with good acoustics. A cluster of dots could be a trance vision, or a tally of visits, or a way of marking that here something happened. Many archaeologists now prefer to think in terms of hybrid possibilities. A single visit to a cave might weave together ritual, teaching, and identity signaling. A group could enter with a practical aim, planning a hunt, tracking herd movements through the year, while framing that work in mythic language. The animal painted on the wall could be at once a real species they hunted, a clan emblem, a spirit helper for a healer, and a reminder of a story told to children on long winter nights. A scene might be painted during an initiation, then revisited during healing rites, later serving as a teaching tool for tracking or anatomy. Meanings could accumulate, not replace one another. Because of this complexity, careful researchers try to move slowly from material traces to claims about belief. They look for patterns across many sites, where paintings are located relative to entrances and light. What animals or signs cluster together, whether footprints, hearths, pigment stains, or broken lamps concentrate in particular chambers. They compare cave art with portable objects, burial practices, and settlement patterns, looking for reinforcing clues rather than single dramatic explanations. They also work with degrees of certainty. It is one thing to say activities in this chamber were probably different from activities near the entrance, and something much bolder to say this was a shaman's private vision cave. The first rests on sediment layers, lamp debris, and wear patterns on the floor. The second requires several interpretive leaps. Still, even with these constraints, a broad picture emerges. The deep caves were not casual canvases. They were approached with preparation and, most likely, with a sense of crossing into a different kind of space. Whatever names they used, spirits, powers, ancestors, animal masters, the people who moved through those shadows seemed to have treated the painted walls as more than decoration. They were constructing a world in which visible and invisible were braided together, and the rock itself could become a partner in that relationship. From here we can turn to another question that touches both belief and practice. Who, in these communities, actually walked down into that braided space and laid pigment on stone, men, women, children, or some combination of all three? When the first great caves were explored in the 19th and early 20th centuries, many researchers quietly assumed they already knew the answer. Of course the artists were men. Of course they were hunters, or shamans, or some combination of the two. In that world, serious work, dangerous, difficult, prestigious work, belonged to adult males almost by default. For a long time, the material evidence was thin enough. that these assumptions went largely unchallenged. A horse is a horse. A bison is a bison. The hand that drew it, unless it left some trace of itself, seemed out of reach. Then archaeologists started paying closer attention to those traces. One of the most important clues comes from the hand stencils, those ghostly silhouettes made by placing a hand on the rock and blowing pigment around it. They preserve proportions very precisely, the relative length of your fingers, the width of your palm, the spread from thumb to little finger. In the last few decades, researchers have tried to use these measurements to infer sex. On average, male and female hands differ in certain ratios, and statistical models can sometimes sort modern hands with decent accuracy. When those models are applied to some cave sites, a surprising pattern appears. A significant number of stencils seem more likely to have been made by women. Not all specialists agree on the methods or the strength of the conclusions. The overlap between male and female hand shapes is large. Populations tens of thousands of years ago may not match modern samples. The models themselves are under constant refinement. Still, even allowing for a wide margin of error, it becomes harder to maintain the picture of cave art as an almost exclusively male project. Other traces tell us that not all the hands belonged to adults. Some outlines and finger flutings, the trails left where someone dragged fingertips through soft clay or thin layers of calcite, are so small they must have been made by children. In certain caves, these child-sized marks are not confined to convenient low walls. They appear high up, where a ladder or adult support would have been needed, and they occur in the same chambers as complex animal figures. Someone brought children into these spaces, and not once, but enough times to leave overlapping patterns of touch and pigment. Footprints add another layer in a few caves. Mud floors have preserved prints in remarkable detail. Careful study has revealed the tracks of adult men, adult women, adolescents, and very young children, all moving through the same galleries. Sometimes the children's steps wander slightly, as if they were pausing, turning, perhaps being guided by the hand. Toolkits can be suggestive too, where the debris of pigment grinding, lamp maintenance, and engraving lies scattered. It often comes in clusters. Frottage marks on stone pallets, microscopic wear on bone engraving tools, drops of paint beside small hearths. All of these point to repeated, purposeful work. Yet there is nothing in the tools themselves that screams male or female. They are simple, portable, and, as far as we can tell, accessible to anyone trusted to handle fire, stone, and colour. Taken together, these lines of evidence have encouraged many archaeologists to rethink older stories. If women's hands are present in the stencils, if children's finger trails wind beside elaborate panels, if mixed groups left their footprints in the same deep chambers, then the act of entering and using the cave may have involved a broader slice of the community than once imagined. That does not mean everyone did everything. It is entirely possible that certain images were restricted to particular people by age, by training, by ritual status. Some individuals might have been especially skilled at drawing or at mixing pigments. Others might have been recognized as ritual leaders. The presence of children's traces does not automatically mean that children painted the great herds on the walls. It may mean they were present as observers, apprentices, or participants in a wider event. Imagine, cautiously, an evening descent. A group moves inward, a few experienced adults carrying lamps, others with bundles of pigment and tools, perhaps several younger people brought along to watch, to learn, to add their own marks at the margins. An older woman or man might direct where a new animal should go, how it should interact with figures already there. A teenager tries their hand on a side wall. A child, lifted up, presses their palm to the rock to receive its first halo of colour. In such a setting, art is not a private performance by a lone genius, but a shared practice in which knowledge flows in multiple directions, from elders to youth, from specialists to the group, from the community to the stone, and through the stone back again. If cave painting was indeed woven into teaching, initiation, and ritual, then inclusive participation would have powerful consequences for how information moved. Children watching the mixing of pigments would learn not just recipes, but where to find the right minerals in the landscape. Adolescents helping to prepare lamps would absorb practical lessons about fuel, fire, and safety. Those allowed to add small motifs near major figures would internalize both technical skills and the stories attached to each animal or sign. Women who spent much of their lives gathering plants and managing daily resources might bring different observational knowledge to the images than men whose focus was more often on the hunt. Their participation could subtly shape which species were chosen, which behaviors were emphasized, which places in the cave were favored. All of this, however, remains a matter of probabilities and patterns, not certainties. We cannot point to a horse at Chauvet or a hand at Sulawesi and say with confidence, this was drawn by a woman, or this child was undergoing initiation. What we can say is that the old picture, a narrow, male-only priesthood of artists, fits the evidence less well than a more complex, more inclusive one. In that more nuanced view, the caves become not just sanctuaries of vision, but classrooms, memory theatres, and family archives, where knowledge passed across generations through pigment, story, and shared presence in the dark. And once we glimpse that wider circle of participants, another question arises. If people across sex and age took part in this art, what does that tell us about the societies that produced it? Not as a single unified civilization, but as many different groups, experimenting with different ways of being human on the same painted stone. When we look at those walls and see the same kinds of animals, the same red and black silhouettes, the same strange signs repeating from Spain to Indonesia, it can be tempting to give it a single name. A civilization, it sounds satisfying. One great Ice Age culture stretching across continents, leaving its signature wherever the rock was dry enough and the pigment held fast. But that word, civilization, comes with a lot of baggage. In ordinary use, it suggests cities and classes, palaces and peasants, kings, temples and taxes. It evokes stone walls rising above crowded streets, written laws, specialized professions, bureaucracy, and armies. Above all, it implies a level of central control, decisions made in one place, shaping lives in many others. Nothing in the caves really points to that. There are no clear images of cities, no pictures of crowded markets, no obvious depictions of rulers towering over followers. We do not find storage buildings or permanent districts outside these caves that match the scale of later urban life. The people who painted these walls were almost certainly mobile, for at least part of the year, following herds, seasons, and shifting resources. Yet they were not simple. The old caricature of mere hunter-gatherers, a handful of people stumbling after game, living from one day to the next, is hard to reconcile with what the caves show us. You do not organize repeated journeys deep underground, maintain lamps, pigments, and scaffolding, remember precise locations of images over centuries, and sustain recognizable styles across regions if your world is nothing but immediate needs and random wandering. What seems more likely is something in between our familiar categories, complex hunter-gatherer societies. Complexity in this sense is not measured by skyscrapers or grain silos, but by how much coordination you need to keep daily life going. Imagine groups whose movements through the year are not haphazard, but planned. Winters spent near sheltered valleys, summers on higher ground. Specific river crossings used generation after generation. Each season has its own tasks. Certain plants to gather at particular stages, certain animals hunted only when their migration brings them close. Knowledge of all this is shared, debated, and taught. Now layer on top of that The social web, bands that meet regularly at certain times of year to exchange partners, goods, and news. Rituals that mark these gatherings, dances, feasts, shared stories. Agreements about who can marry whom, who owes what to which in-laws, how disputes are settled so the network doesn't fracture. These are not written laws, but they are rules, and they take memory and negotiation to maintain. Cave art fits comfortably inside this world, not as the proclamation of a king, but as a kind of social anchor. A place where several groups, related by kinship or alliance, can recognize themselves in the same images. A bison painted in a style familiar from far away might say, in its own quiet way, "Your people were here, our people are here, we belong to the same story." This does not require a capital city or a priesthood giving orders. It requires shared understandings about the animals that matter, the signs that carry meaning, the rituals that call people into the dark at the right moment. Networks can produce patterns that look from a great distance like the output of a single centralized system. If multiple groups visit the same caves over centuries, following similar pathways and guided by similar stories, the art on the walls will accumulate into something that feels unified. Styles will stabilize, conventions will harden, new additions will respect old arrangements. Outsiders might be tempted to call this the work of a civilization, but underneath, the mechanism can be distributed. Knowledge travels person to person, marriage to marriage, gathering to gathering, not through written decrees, but through songs, gestures, and repeated journeys to familiar stone. When we think this way, the continuity in cave art stops pointing toward a lost empire, and instead toward durable traditions. The fact that certain signs recur over thousands of years may not mean there was a central authority enforcing their use. It may mean that the stories attached to those signs were powerful enough to endure on their own, passed down, because people found them meaningful, helpful, or sacred. Continuity without centralization is something we see in many small-scale societies even today. A design woven into cloth by one community can appear in another hundreds of kilometers away, not because they answer to the same ruler, but because marriages, trade, and imitation slowly carry motifs across the landscape. A song can spread through festivals and visits, gathering variations along the way, yet remaining recognizable at its core. Cave art may be doing something similar on a deeper timescale. Each new generation sees what is already there, learns the appropriate stories, and adds its own marks in ways that respect the inherited structure. Sometimes there are bursts of innovation, sometimes long periods of quiet. The overall effect is one of remarkable stability, but it is built from countless small choices, not from a master plan. Focusing on this kind of complexity keeps us from falling into comforting myths. We do not need to imagine a vanished kingdom issuing artistic directives for Sulawesi and Spain. We can instead picture a world of many human groups, each with its own dialect, its own preferred foods and favourite myths, yet all capable of recognizing certain shared images and responding to them. In that sense, the caves are less the ruins of an empire, and more like meeting places on a long, branching road. They remind us that sophisticated planning, rich ritual life and enduring identity do not belong only to farmers behind walls. People who moved with the seasons, who watched the sky and the animals, who remembered paths through forests and ice, could weave social worlds as intricate as any later city, held together not by stone towers but by stories, obligations, and paint on the patient rock. And as we follow those painted threads, another question slowly comes into focus. What kind of environment were these people navigating? And why might such elaborate, enduring art have mattered so much in the harsh, changeable world of the Ice Age? To understand that world, we have to cool the temperature in our minds. Most of the great cave art belongs to the last part of the Pleistocene, when ice sheets were advancing and retreating like a slow tide over the northern hemisphere. This was not one long unbroken winter. It was a pulse-driven climate, long cold glacial phases interrupted by shorter, milder interglacials and brief, jittery warm spells called interstadials. Sea levels rose and fell by tens of meters. Coastlines we know today were sometimes dry plains. Rivers frequently changed course. Forests advanced, then withered back into steppe and tundra. Over the span of a few thousand years, a blink in geological terms, but a marathon in human terms, the environment of a region could be transformed. If you lived then, you could not assume that the place your grandparents had used would work exactly the same way for you. Some winters came earlier, some summers were shorter and drier. Herds shifted their migration routes in response to new vegetation and fresh water. A valley that had been rich hunting ground might empty out as the grasses changed. A coastal lagoon could vanish behind a wall of advancing sand. Survival in that world depended on flexibility. People did not wander aimlessly, but their yearly movements had to be adjustable. Think of a mental map not as a fixed loop, but as a set of options. Winter refuges in sheltered valleys, spring routes following rivers, summer visits to higher plateaus, autumn gatherings near salmon runs or nut groves. In good years, maybe you extended your range. In bad years, you contracted or cut across to an alternate campsite a few days' walk away. This kind of mobility leaves fingerprints in where we find art. Painted caves and rock shelters cluster along old migration corridors, near river systems, on the edges of former ice sheets, in coastal zones that would have been rich in marine life when sea levels were lower. They appear in regions that would have served as refuges during the coldest phases, milder pockets where plants and animals could hang on when the surrounding landscape was harsher. The timing of intense artistic activity often lines up with ecological turning points, periods when the climate was improving after a deep freeze, or wobbling between colder and warmer states. It is as if people, faced with shifting patterns in the animals they relied on, were also consolidating and renewing the symbolic patterns that tied their communities together. When you move through a landscape that is unstable, certain places become especially valuable. A cave that stays dry, season after season, is more than a shelter. It is a fixed point in a moving world. You can lose a particular herd or a berry patch. A river can cut a new channel, but the cave mouth in the limestone cliff is still there, still dark, still waiting. Filling that place with images turns it into an anchor. The painted walls may have functioned as a kind of long-term memory device. A herd of bison in one chamber, mammoths in another, might cue stories about when those animals come, how they behave, what rules govern their hunting. Abstract signs repeated near certain species might remind people of taboos or rituals connected to them. The cave is no longer just rock. It is a story map, updated and revisited as conditions change. In this view, art is not decoration added after survival is taken care of. It is one of the tools of survival. When resources are reliable, you can afford to improvise more. When they are uncertain, planning and coordination matter. The more precarious the food supply, the higher the cost of social breakdown, misremembered rules or failed cooperation. Some researchers think this is exactly when symbolic behavior becomes most elaborate, when groups invest more energy in rituals, markings and shared images, as if shoring up the invisible structures that keep them functioning together. It is a hypothesis, but the pattern is suggestive. Periods of environmental stress, colder snaps, abrupt local drying, sudden changes in available game, sometimes coincide with spikes in archaeological evidence for symbolic activity, more ornaments, more carefully made tools, more intensive use of caves. When the outside world becomes less predictable, the inside world of shared meaning may become more important. This was not a uniform story across the globe. The Ice Age was not the same everywhere. In some regions, dense forests dominated. Here, visibility was limited. Hunting relied more on tracking and ambush than on long-range pursuit. We often find more engravings on portable objects, carved bones and antlers that can move with a group through the trees. Caves in such landscapes might show intimate, close-up animal images, reflecting encounters at short range. Along coasts, lower sea levels exposed vast continental shelves. People could exploit fish, shellfish, seabirds, and stranded marine mammals. Their movements might have been more linear, following shorelines rich in predictable resources. Much of their rock art, if it existed on what were then coastal cliffs, is now drowned. Where we do find surviving sites, we sometimes see marine animals, boats, and signs that might relate to tides and currents, a different symbolic focus shaped by saltwater economies. On open steppes and mammoth grasslands, life revolved around large, migratory herds. Here, we see grand processions of bison, horses, aurochs, and mammoths covering cave walls. The scale of the images mirrors the scale of the landscape. Long horizons, big animals, big distances. Groups might meet seasonally at rich hunting locales, and caves nearby could serve as ceremonial centres, decorated by multiple bands who shared not just prey species but broad mythic frameworks about them. Mountains added yet another variation. High plateaus and valleys created sharp ecological contrasts over short distances. Some Denisovan and later human groups adapted to these vertical worlds, moving up and down with the seasons. Their symbolic practices may have emphasized peaks, sky beings, and thresholds between levels of the world, just as coastal groups might emphasize the line between land and sea. Across all these settings, one thing is consistent. Art, wherever it appears, seems to cluster around edges and transitions, between forest and plain, land and water, lowlands and highlands, darkness and light. Caves themselves are literal thresholds. In an ice age defined by shifting borders of ice, sea, and vegetation, it is not hard to imagine why humans might be drawn to mark the boundary places most intensely. By painting the walls of a familiar cave, a group could, in a sense, hold on to a stable reference point. Even as glaciers advanced, rivers wandered and herds changed their routes. The images become a guarantee that the story continues, that the network of alliances and obligations still exists, that we, however that group defined itself, are still here, still connected to this place, even if the world beyond the entrance feels more uncertain with each passing year. And once you start to see art as part of that survival strategy, another question emerges. In a landscape so dynamic, how did these networks of people actually connect, travel, and carry their images and stories from one region to another? If you look at the cave walls long enough, a quiet realization creeps in. Some of these ideas are not staying put. In Europe, there are certain ways of drawing horses that recur from cave to cave over hundreds of kilometers. A particular way of shaping the mane, a stylized line for the jaw, a habit of exaggerating the belly or the curve of the neck. Abstract signs, too, show up again and again, ladder-like marks, branching Y shapes, dots arranged in neat rows. In Sulawesi, tens of thousands of years earlier, hand stencils cluster with specific animal forms, and the animals themselves are drawn with conventions that repeat across different rock shelters. When the same motif, with the same odd little quirks, appears in places separated by days or weeks of walking, it suggests something more than coincidence. It suggests that ideas were moving. One way this can happen is through direct contact. People from one band visit another, stay for a season, share food, stories and techniques, and then move on, carrying a few new tricks back with them. Another is through chains of contact. Group A visits Group B, which visits Group C, and slowly an image style spreads like a whisper down a line of campfires. The caves we see today are only the most durable pieces of that conversation. Most of the information exchange would have happened in ordinary places, along riverbanks where people napped stone together, around hearths in open shelters, on windswept ridges where someone carved a bone or scratched a symbol into a piece of antler while waiting for game to appear. Portable objects, skin clothing, painted bodies, all of these would have been moving canvases that could display and propagate motifs from one region to the next. This is why archaeologists pay so much attention to patterning. When a particular sign system, a stable set of shapes and arrangements, shows up across widely separated sites, it begins to look like a shared symbolic vocabulary. Not identical, not centrally controlled, but recognizable enough that someone walking into a new cave might think, "Ah, they use that sign here too." Such patterns point to networks. And nowhere does this become more dramatic than in island Southeast Asia. The Sulawesi paintings, some of them older than the famous European caves, sit on an island that was never fully connected to mainland Asia, even at the lowest Ice Age sea levels. To reach Sulawesi, early humans had to cross open water. Not a quick splash through a shallow channel, but genuine sea crossings, probably out of sight of land for at least part of the journey. The people who left those handprints and anoa and pig deer figures were descended from groups that had already mastered something extraordinary, building watercraft good enough to carry families' tools and perhaps a few animals over straits and currents. This is not just about bravery, it implies planning. You need to know when the sea is calmest, how tides behave, where currents will carry you. You have to anticipate how much fresh water and food to stock, how to keep a fire alive or rekindle it on a damp shore, and when you land on a new island, you have to figure out, fast, which plants are safe, which animals are dangerous, where to find shelter. The same mind that can manage that kind of logistics is perfectly capable of managing symbolic systems. Some researchers think that the spread of art styles between islands in this region hints at maritime information highways, chains of contact running along archipelagos, where people on one island knew enough about their neighbours 2 or 3 crossings away to share stories about them. We do not yet see a tidy map of these routes in the rock, but the very presence of early art on islands that required deliberate voyaging raises that possibility. Genetics and archaeology add a soft chorus in the background. When scientists study ancient DNA and the genomes of living people in Oceania and Southeast Asia, they find layers of ancestry that point to multiple waves of movement through these islands over tens of thousands of years. Some of these lineages carry traces of Denisovan-related DNA, suggesting that different human groups met, interbred, and moved on. Archaeological finds, distinctive tool traditions, similar shell ornaments, shared ways of working stone, sometimes line up with these inferred movements. They hint that people were not just drifting apart into isolated pockets, but repeatedly reconnecting, folding new arrivals into existing networks, swapping not just genes, but techniques and symbols. Even in regions without sea crossings, the movement of materials tells a similar story. Pigments used in cave paintings are often local: red ochre from a nearby deposit, charcoal from the last fire. But sometimes the mineral fingerprint of the pigment does not match the immediate area. A particular shade of manganese black might come from a source dozens of kilometers away. A greenish earth used in one shelter can be traced to a vein on the far side of a mountain range. The same is true of other objects. Beads made from marine shells appear far inland. Their species can betray their origin. A snail that only lives on a certain stretch of coast, a shell type linked to a particular current-swept bay, exotic stone, obsidian, fine-grained cherts, turns up in camps and caves far from any natural outcrop, implying that someone carried it there, either directly or through exchanges along a chain of acquaintances. You do not need formal marketplaces for this kind of trade. You just need repeated encounters, trust, and a sense of value. A band that controls a rich ochre source might give lumps of pigment to their in-laws in another valley, who pass some on to visitors from further downriver. In return, information flows the other way. News about herds, weather, conflicts, and marriages. Over time, such exchanges weave invisible threads across the landscape. This is what it means for networks to exist without states, cities, or writing. There is no central authority organizing caravans, yet obsidian from one mountain ends up in a dozen distant communities. There is no bureaucracy cataloguing designs, yet particular animal styles and abstract signs echo across whole regions. The glue is social, not institutional. Kinship ties, ritual obligations, and the simple human tendency to be curious about strangers can sustain surprisingly wide spheres of contact. A teenager from one group might go to live with a partner's family in another valley, bringing songs and stories learned at home. Elders might travel to distant caves for seasonal gatherings, adding their own marks beside images made generations before by people from other bands. And the art on the walls becomes both witness and participant in this process. A familiar sign seen in a distant cave could reassure a visitor that despite dialect differences and unfamiliar faces, they were still moving within a recognizable cultural orbit. A new motif, freshly learned, might be carried back and quietly incorporated into local traditions. In this way, hand by hand and line by line, the painted record hints at something we cannot see directly, a world of paths and crossings, where ideas flowed along with people, binding scattered communities into loose, resilient networks, long before anyone carved a city from stone or pressed a symbol into wet clay. Those networks, however, were delicate. The same roots that carried gifts and stories could also carry competition, conflict, and the first shadows of displacement. As populations grew and ranges overlapped more tightly, the meaning of those shared symbols may have started to change. For most of human time, these networks of caves and paths were invisible to everyone but the people who used them. Then, very recently, we started stumbling back into them. Many of the famous caves came to light almost by accident. A dog chasing a rabbit down a hole, a teenager feeling a faint draft through a crack in the rocks, a farmer breaking through a thin ceiling while clearing stones from a field. One moment the world is ordinary, the next, a beam of light swings across a wall and catches something that should not be there, a horse running in red, a bison turning its head, a spray of handprints that look disconcertingly like your own. After the shock comes the work of turning a chance discovery into knowledge. Archaeologists and speleologists move carefully, because the first footsteps into a sealed space can start the clock on its destruction. They map every tunnel and chamber, sometimes crawling for hours to sketch the shape of a passage that only a child could stand up in. They measure temperature, humidity, airflow. They photograph each panel again and again, under different light, at different angles, building an image archive that can outlast the rock itself. Then come the scanners. Laser beams sweep over walls in absolute darkness, collecting millions of points of data to create three-dimensional models. Tiny irregularities in the surface become visible, finger grooves in soft clay, faint outlines of figures that are almost invisible to the naked eye, layers of repainting that show how an image evolved over time. High-resolution digital photography, often in wavelengths our eyes cannot see, picks up traces of pigment in scratches that once looked like bare stone. The idea is simple: document everything before it changes. Because once a cave is opened, change is almost guaranteed. The threats are quiet, patient, and everywhere. Just breathing in a closed chamber alters the balance. Exhaled carbon dioxide and water vapour raise humidity. which can encourage delicate films of condensation to form and dissolve crystals in the rock. Temperature shifts caused by lights or the warmth of visitors can coax salts to migrate to the surface, blooming into white crusts that push paint off the wall grain by grain. Tourism multiplies these effects. When a cave becomes famous, pressure builds to let people see it. Groups of visitors bring microbes on their clothes, their hair, their skin. Some of these microorganisms find the new environment hospitable. A bacterial mat can start as a few specks on a damp patch and spread into a dark, velvety stain that slowly devours the underlying pigment. Fungi, too, can take hold, their filaments insinuating themselves into the rock. Outside the cave, the modern world pushes in. Pollution from distant factories can change the chemistry of rainwater that percolates through the limestone. Mining can shake the bedrock, crack ceilings, or lower water tables that once kept a cave's microclimate stable. Even changes in land use, clearing a forest above a cave, diverting a river, can shift how air and moisture move underground, disturbing a balance that held for tens of thousands of years. So, each new discovery immediately raises an ethical question. How much access is worth the risk? Some sites have taken the strict route. They are closed to the public entirely, guarded by locked doors and carefully controlled entry for researchers only. Others have tried compromise. Famous caves have been replicated in meticulous detail a short walk away. Every bump and groove of the original walls is reproduced, every painting copied with obsessive care, so that visitors can walk through a second cave while the real one rests in darkness. Digital technology extends this strategy. Three-dimensional scans can be turned into virtual caves that anyone can enter from a laptop or headset. Researchers can zoom in on a centimetre of wall from the other side of the planet, tracing a line of pigment pixel by pixel without ever setting foot underground. In theory, this could democratize access while reducing physical pressure on the originals. In practice, it raises its own questions. Does a replica, no matter how perfect, carry the same weight as a place where ancient hands actually moved? Who decides which caves are scanned, which are copied, which remain secret between a small circle of specialists and the local people who live above them? Because local communities are never just a backdrop to these stories. For many, the hills and cliffs that hold painted caves are part of everyday life. Grazing land, paths to school, places where herbs are gathered or shrines visited. In some regions, stories about spirit holes or ancestors' houses long predate any archaeological survey. When a cave is suddenly reclassified as a World Heritage Site, the people who have lived with it the longest can find their relationship to it rewritten overnight. Good stewardship tries to fold those perspectives in. Local guides often become the first line of protection, watching for unauthorized entry, noticing new cracks or stains on the walls. Community members may help design visitor rules, deciding how many people can enter in a day, what kind of behavior is acceptable, which seasons should be off-limits entirely. In some cases, communities choose to keep certain caves unpublicized, sharing knowledge only with those they trust. Still, damage happens, a careless touch that leaves skin oils on a fragile painting, a misjudged air conditioning system that dries a chamber too much, a mining blast miles away that reverberates through rock and drops a flake of painted ceiling to the floor. Sometimes vandalism is deliberate, a name carved beside a basin, graffiti sprayed across a panel. More often it is ignorance, the simple human urge to get a little closer, to feel stone that should never be touched. When a panel is lost, even in a small way, something vanishes that cannot be reconstructed from photographs and scans. Pigments carry microscopic details about how they were ground and mixed. Overlapping lines can reveal the sequence in which figures were drawn, hinting at whether a scene was composed in one sitting or built up over generations. The exact relation between a painting and a crack in the wall, a lump in the floor, a stalactite overhead may encode choices that mattered to the people who made it. Lose those details and entire categories of questions close. We can no longer ask whether a particular animal was added after a rockfall, or whether a motif clusters around a now eroded feature that once had ritual significance. We cannot test new methods on vanished pigments to refine our dating techniques. Future generations of archaeologists with better tools and different ideas are left with a thinner record. In that sense, preservation is not just about keeping pretty pictures intact. It is about keeping possibilities alive. Every undisturbed panel holds questions we do not yet know how to ask. Every flake of paint still attached to stone carries information that could change how we understand the people who painted it. To protect these caves is to protect a conversation across tens of millennia, one that we are only just learning to hear. And as our tools sharpen and our questions grow more ambitious, the fate of that conversation will depend not only on what we find next, but on what still remains to be found at all. For all the care, all the scanning, all the chemistry and statistics, the caves stay stubborn. They keep their biggest secrets close. The most obvious question is also the hardest to touch. What did any of this actually mean to the people who made it? We can guess. We can talk about hunting magic, teaching tools, memory palaces, spirit maps. We can compare motifs across continents and note that bison and horses and handprints keep turning up. But when you stand in front of a painted wall, even with every scholarly article in your head, there's still a gap between what you can describe and what they felt. Was that bison a specific animal someone remembered, down to the scar on its flank? Was it a symbol for plenty or clan or danger? Was it part of a story that every child knew by heart, or something only a few initiates ever saw by torchlight? We don't know. Our words, religion, ritual, art, magic, might be clumsy nets thrown over something that doesn't quite match any of them. Then there's authorship. We have measurements suggesting that many hand stencils belong to women. We have footprints of children deep in the dark, pigment traces at heights that would have needed scaffolding, or someone lifting someone else. We have hints of specialization in the most complex panels. But we don't yet know whether there were recognized painters, people whose role was to make and maintain images, or whether painting was something anyone might do at particular moments in their lives. Was there a teacher and an apprentice, an elder correcting the angle of a young person's line? Or was it more like a communal act, a whole group singing or chanting while one person traced out a figure on behalf of everyone? Behind those questions is an even larger one. When did all of this begin? The oldest confirmed images we have now are astonishingly ancient, but they may not be the first. Caves collapse, rock falls, sea levels rise and swallow coastal shelters that were once dry. In some parts of the world, sandstone and granite surfaces weather away too fast to preserve pigment for hundreds of centuries. So when we say this is the oldest known painting, what we're really saying is this is the oldest one that has survived in a place we've actually looked, with methods we trust right now. The true origins of image making may lie in sites we have not yet recognized as important, or in regions that have barely begun to be surveyed. Underexplored landscapes stretch across much of the planet. Vast tracts of Central Africa, interior Australia, parts of the Amazon, high plateaus in Asia, remote limestone towers in Southeast Asia, obscure ravines in the Caucasus and Balkans, small rock shelters tucked under overhangs, hidden by vegetation, or facing some forgotten valley that no paved road now approaches. In many of these places, local people know of markings on stone. Some are already recognized as historical or sacred. Others might be passed with barely a glance, the way we ignore graffiti on an underpass. It only takes one of these to shift from curious stain to sample sent to the lab for a timeline to move by 10,000 years. Our tools for noticing and understanding are changing quickly. Improved dating techniques keep pushing deeper into the past. Uranium-Series methods are getting more precise, able to take smaller samples of calcite and bracket the age of a painting more tightly. Refinements in radiocarbon calibration curves tweak dates by hundreds of years, sometimes enough to change which culture, which climate phase, which species we think a panel belongs to. Residue analysis can now identify traces of binders and additives in pigments that once looked like simple red or black smears. Under the microscope and in the mass spectrometer, tiny flecks of paint start revealing recipes. Fat and blood, egg and plant gum, charcoal from a particular tree, ochre heated to exactly the right temperature. Each new ingredient can hint at trade routes, seasonal movements, or layers of meaning we hadn't imagined. Three-dimensional scanning is merging with machine learning. Algorithms trained on thousands of images learn to spot patterns our eyes slide over, faint outlines under later paintings, repeated arrangements of dots that might represent a counting system, stylized ways of drawing animals that cluster in particular regions or time periods. An AI that has seen every known horse in European cave art might flag a single, almost erased figure in a minor shelter as belonging to a much older or entirely different tradition. And sometimes all it takes is one date. One hand stencil found to be 10,000 years older than any other on that continent. One engraved line shown to be from a time when we thought no humans lived in that valley. One pigment trace that proves people were painting in a region we had written off as empty until much later. When that happens, the tidy diagrams in textbooks, arrows of migration, timelines of first art, sequences of style, bend and stretch. Ideas that seemed solid a year ago become footnotes. Theories built around a particular cave, as a starting point, have to make room for older cousins elsewhere. This uncertainty isn't a flaw, it's the live edge of the subject. For every image we can date, there may be many more waiting in darkness, or already eroding in the open air, where no one has yet stopped to look closely. For every careful interpretation, there are alternative readings that might fit just as well once the next piece of evidence turns up. If that sort of open question fascinates you, the story doesn't end with this episode. On the website, the link is in the description. There's a book collecting 12 of the most intriguing unexplained mysteries from across history, including some that brush against this world of early art. This week there's a discount, in case you want something you can drift off with offline, letting your mind wander through puzzles that no one has solved yet. Because that is the real invitation the caves offer. Not certainty, but curiosity. In the flicker of a torch across a wall, you can feel how much we don't know, how much is still possible. Somewhere under a hill or behind a fallen slab, there may be a panel of paintings that will force us to rethink when and where image-making began, who was involved, and why they thought it mattered. Until we find it, the oldest known caves remain both an archive and a question mark. They show us that people like us were already thinking in images far earlier than anyone suspected. They leave us with the sense that the story is incomplete by design, that part of being human is learning to live with that incompletion, to keep following faint traces into the dark, wondering what might be waiting just beyond the reach of our current light. So where does that leave us here at the end of the tunnel, with all these animals and handprints and signs drifting through your mind in the dark? If we step back from the individual caves and arguments, a few things do seem to hold. First, the images really are traces of minds at work, minds not unlike ours. Whatever the exact meanings of a particular bison or spray of dots, whoever bent close to grind the pigment, and steady their hand against the rock was making deliberate choices, choosing this wall and not that one, this animal and not another, this curve of line, this intensity of colour, this place in the sequence. They were not sleepwalking through survival. They were noticing, selecting, arranging. Second, none of it happened in isolation. Even the most remote chamber depends on everything outside it. The hunt that brought fat for the lamp, the gathering that brought ochre from a ridge miles away, the stories or instructions that decided which shapes belonged on which panel. Every line on the stone is also a line of connection, between people in a group, between groups spread along a valley, between generations who learned the same ways of drawing, and maybe the same ways of reading those drawings. The caves are not just galleries, they're junctions in networks we can only dimly reconstruct. Third, the art lasts longer than the arrangements that produced it. The camp circles, the sleeping places, the arguments and jokes, and whispered fears have all blown away. What remains are these stubborn, fragile images, still carrying enough information that across tens of thousands of years we can say, someone stood here. Someone cared enough to come back, to retouch, to protect. Someone thought the risk and effort were worth it. That may be the deepest thing the oldest paintings tell us, even when we disagree about their purpose. They suggest that part of being human, in many different times and places, is wanting to externalize what's in your head, to pin attention and memory and meaning to something outside the body, where it can outlast you. From there, interpretation flowers in many directions. You can lean toward ritual or toward teaching. You can think in terms of game trails and seasons, or in terms of spirit worlds and altered states. The same panel can be a hunting manual, a community charter, a cosmology, a diary, depending on which clues you privilege. Right now, with the evidence we have, it's wise to let several of those readings sit side by side. Multiple explanations might even have been true at once for the people who made the marks. Our categories don't have to compress their possibilities into a single label. So as you drift towards sleep, you might imagine your own version of that world. A small circle of people deep in the earth. The quiet crackle of a lamp. The smell of smoke and mineral dust. Someone lifting their hand to the wall, or tracing the outline of a horse learned from a teacher, from an elder, from many winters of watching. You can hold at the same time the solid things we do know, the dates, the pigments, the shared motifs, and the soft edges of everything we don't. The caves invite that balance, a kind of calm curiosity, a willingness to rest inside unanswered questions. If you'd like more puzzles to wander through on other nights, there's that book I mentioned, collecting 12 of the most intriguing prehistoric and historical mysteries, including a few that circle back to this deep-time art. You can find out more and pick up a copy if you like through the website linked in the description. And if you've enjoyed this slow journey through the oldest paintings we know, it really helps if you tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you don't miss the next night's story. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what image from these caves has decided to stay with you tonight, lingering on the inside of your eyelids as you fall asleep.